They called it a garden world in the brief, but that was an understatement. Euphrosyne wasn't just fertile, it was flawless. 2 suns overhead, perfect distance, perfect temperature, no tectonic instability, no acid rains, just soft golden plains, slow-blooming blue orchids, and the scent of citrus in the wind. As my shuttle descended into Sector Aurelia, I realized this wasn't a world. It was a sculpture, shaped, maintained, curated. Even the clouds had symmetry. I was assigned to Euphrosyne as an Imperial Records Chronicler, Tier Sigma. My task was simple: observe, document, and preserve a formal archive of Euphrosyne's conditions, governance, and spiritual compliance for the Officio Archivum. Translation: make sure the paradise wasn't hiding any sins. It was a formality. Worlds like Euphrosyne were rare, but not unheard of. I'd documented shrine worlds drowning in incense, agri-worlds where wheat stretched beyond the horizon, and even a water world that worshipped a kraken-shaped reef. But this felt manufactured, like someone asked a child to draw what happiness looked like, and the Mechanicus made it real. The greeting party waited for me at the docking spire, 6 civilians in white robes, unarmed, unscarred, all smiling, too wide, too long. Their smiles didn't shift when they blinked, didn't soften when they exhaled, just held in place, like a mask. The woman at the front stepped forward and bowed. "I am Klein," she said, "Prefect of Sector Aurelia. On behalf of the entire planetary commune, we welcome you." I nodded, reached for my data slate. The instinct to record everything was bone deep now. "Thank you, Prefect. I'm here to assess local infrastructure, spiritual adherence, and citizen reports. I'll need access to your central archives and..." I hesitated. "Somewhere to stay." Her smile deepened. "We've already prepared everything." She didn't ask for credentials, didn't scan my ident tags, didn't even ask my name. Just turned and walked. Her robe didn't gather dust. There was none. They gave me a tower suite overlooking the orchards. The walls were marble. The windows opened with a thought. There was no key, no lock, no cogitator system. "Security isn't necessary here," Klein had said. "There is no crime." I believed her, because no one here looked like they could commit one. The citizens strolled in lines, never touching, never arguing, never hurrying. They waved, smiled, bowed, and yet, not once did I hear laughter. Not once did I see a child fall and cry. No accidents, no mistakes, just harmony so precise it felt rehearsed, like they weren't living, just performing. I ran my first scans that evening. Atmosphere, optimal. Radiation, negligible. Soil content, uniform across 99% of the continent. I checked the date logs. The planet had been declared a Paradise-class resource world 300 years ago. No significant geological events since. No civil unrest, no religious deviation, no contact with warp entities, and most damning of all, no deaths in recorded history. I paused, scrolled again, confirmed. The mortality log was empty, not infrequent, empty. I filed the anomaly under potential clerical error and continued. The next day I began my interviews. The first citizen, an elder named Relo, was 112 standard years old. His face was smooth, his hair still black. He told me he worked the citrus groves every day for 90 years, no complaints, no change in schedule, no injuries. "You ever leave the grove?" I asked. He tilted his head. "No need. The fruit always grows." "What about festivals, days of rest?" He blinked. "We rest when we sleep. The work is joy." I marked his responses as conditioned repetition and moved on. The next 5 interviews were the same. Different names, same words. They were content, they were healthy, they were grateful. It was like reading the same paragraph with new fonts. Even their eye contact was too direct. Unblinking, not hostile, not vacant, just fixed, as if waiting for a cue that never came. I asked to see the Sisterhood Shrine next. Klein accompanied me. The structure was radiant. Polished adamantine arches, silken banners, a gold aquila that caught both suns. But when I stepped inside, my stomach turned. Not from scent or light, from silence. There was no chanting, no incense, just 30 figures kneeling in absolute stillness. Each wore white cloth and bore a single brand on their forehead, a circle, empty. They didn't look up when we entered, didn't shift, didn't breathe. Klein whispered beside me, "They are praying." To the Emperor, she turned to me. The smile never left her face. To continuity. That night I couldn't sleep, not from fear, from disorientation. The stars above the tower window shifted too precisely, every constellation aligned with the center of the sky by the hour. Even the moons took turns reflecting the sun's light, never overlapping. I ran a basic astral recalibration scan. Results came back flagged. Orbital pattern 2 uniform. System AI flagged it as simulated data, a known glitch in cogitative visual renders when processing artificial star fields. But I wasn't running a simulation. I was looking out a window. I turned away, and in the reflection of the glass, I saw someone else staring back, not me. He was smiling. I confronted Klein the next day. "You have a problem with conformity here," I said bluntly. "You're either repressing individuality or something's interfering with higher cognitive variability." She didn't flinch. "Is that your conclusion?" "Not yet, but I haven't seen a single deviant citizen. Not a drunk, not a criminal, not even someone bored." "And that bothers you? It should bother you." She nodded slowly. "Because you are still differentiating between happiness and freedom." I frowned. "You sound like a philosopher." She stepped closer, too close, whispered, "Paradise is the absence of questions." I ran, not from her, from the stillness. I walked the eastern grove alone, scanning random flora just for something imperfect. A fallen branch, a weed, anything, nothing. Then, a patch of dirt, 6 feet wide, no plants, no grass, just soil. I crouched, pulled out a sampler, and heard it, a low hum, faint, mechanical, from beneath the ground. I tapped the soil. It rang, not hollow, forged. I ran a localized Auspex scan, structure detected, depth, 3.2 meters, material, unclassified. I flagged it for excavation. The system returned. Error, Sector Omega, access denied. I hadn't entered Sector Omega, not consciously, but the system knew, and so did something else. That night, the reflection didn't show me at all, just the room behind me, empty, even though I was still sitting there. I reached toward the glass, touched it. The glass was warm, like skin. Then the face returned. But this time, it wasn't smiling. It was mouthing words. I couldn't hear them. I could only read the lips. "Don't forget why you came." It was the 3rd day since my arrival on Euphrosyne, and I still hadn't heard anyone shout, scream, or weep aloud. Even in the marketplaces filled with vendors and produce, there were no raised voices, only synchronized greetings and hollow laughter. The soundscape of the city was precisely arranged, birds chirping at fixed intervals, children giggling softly, fountains burbling in harmonic tones. But something about that harmony disturbed me more than chaos ever could, because nothing truly alive stays that perfectly arranged without being forced. I stood in the center of Aurelia's largest plaza, surrounded by statues, flowering trees, and rows of citizens passing in silent symmetry. Not one footstep was out of rhythm, not a single cough or sneeze. Even the breeze obeyed the rhythm like clockwork. I turned slowly, scanning their faces, their slow, serene movements, all smiles, all vacant, like marionettes repeating a script I didn't remember reading. I stepped toward one of the vendors, a young man with perfect skin, hair immaculately parted, standing beside a stack of glowing fruit. "Good morning," I said. "What are these called?" I motioned toward the fruit, their surfaces glimmering faintly under the artificial twin suns. He smiled, not just with his mouth, but with his entire face, as if joy had been installed into his facial structure. "They are nectar spires," he answered, voice perfectly modulated. No accent, no emotion, like a Vox recording running a looped greeting protocol. I nodded. "Do you grow them yourself? How long have you worked here?" I glanced down to record his responses, data slate already in hand. "I've always worked here. The nectar spires grow year-round." They require no tending. They ripen when they are needed. His smile never faded. When they're needed, I asked, looking back up. How do they know when that is? I scanned the booth for machinery or cogitator tech. He answered, the system provides. It knows the cycle. There is no waste on Euphrosyne. He bowed slightly, like a protocol subroutine finishing. I thanked him and stepped away, but something stayed in my mind, that phrasing, when they are needed. Who decides need, and how? Later that day, I reviewed my sound recordings from the plaza using a dampened Auspex calibrated to detect ambient deviation, vibration anomalies, and subsonic pulses. The waveform looked manufactured, no variation in the crowd noise, no accidental laughter, no overtalk or layered conversation. Just one smooth, filtered hum. I ran a compare scan with other Hive plazas, even Shrine World's sanctums, and all showed the expected spikes, lulls, and emotional resonance patterns. But not Euphrosyne. Here, even emotion had a beat, a ceiling, a threshold. Nothing too loud, nothing too sharp, nothing unpredictable or uncontrolled. I stared at the data and said aloud, to no one, this doesn't look like a world. It looks like a recording. That night, I tried to test it, to disrupt the rhythm, to provoke something raw and unfiltered from this perfect veneer of civility. I walked into a public tea house where 20 or so citizens sat in pristine rows, sipping crystalline beverages in absolute silence, each smiling gently. I walked straight through the center, knocking over a chair as I passed, letting it clatter against the ground louder than anything heard all day. No one flinched. No one turned. No one even blinked. I picked up the chair and slammed it back down harder, deliberately harsh, sharp, a sound that should have drawn eyes immediately. Still, they continued sipping. They sat frozen in their tranquil loop, as though my action hadn't registered or was already accounted for by something. On the way out, I stopped beside one of the men and leaned close enough that my breath should have brushed his cheek. You heard that, didn't you? I asked. Tell me you heard me. You're not machines. Say something real. My voice trembled just slightly. His eyes never left his glass, but his lips finally moved, slow, deliberate, as if being forced through molasses by some ancient programming. Disruption is always part of balance. All inputs are anticipated. Nothing is irregular if the system expects the deviation. Then he took another sip. I returned to my suite and requested a direct link to planetary records, not the curated ones provided by Prefect Klein, but raw census data. At first, the access request stalled. A minute passed, then another, then the screen blinked, and the files poured in, too quickly, too cleanly. I opened the citizenship archive and searched for common variables, death records, migration history, birth patterns, and demographic age fluctuations over the last century. The numbers were flawless, too flawless. A perfect pyramid of ages, no deaths, no anomalies, just mathematical elegance across generations. A human impossibility by any measure. It was as if the population was grown, not born, like someone had modeled a society, inserted it into real space and pressed run simulation. And yet, these people bled. I had seen a woman cut her hand in the orchard. I'd seen a man sweat under sunlight. So they were real, of flesh, but flesh living inside a pattern not of their own, designed, not raised, formatted, not evolved, contained. At 3 a.m., I heard footsteps outside my door, light, even, pacing. I stood, approached the door, not to open it, just to listen. The steps paused, then something scraped, like chalk against metal, deliberate and slow. I pressed my ear to the wall, silence. Then, a whisper, not from outside, from above. I looked up. The ceiling vent was open, just slightly, too high to reach without a ladder, too precise to be an accident. The whisper repeated, words not quite language, more like vocalized intent shaped by something that didn't understand human syntax. Then it said clearly in my voice, "You will forget this part." I reported the vent issue to Prefect Klein that morning. She arrived without entourage, no guards, no concern. Just that same frozen smile and soft footfalls on the immaculate floor. When I showed her the vent, it was closed, sealed, unmarked. She tilted her head. "There is no ventilation in this sector," she said. "The suite uses atmospheric bloom filters. That ceiling panel is decorative only." "It was open," I said. "I heard something." "Memory is often fragile after interplanetary transfer," she replied. "Paradise stabilizes the mind, but only if you surrender the residue of chaos." I stared at her. "You think I'm hallucinating?" She touched my shoulder gently. "I think you haven't begun healing yet, but you will." She turned to leave. I stared at the vent, and it blinked, just once, like an eye, closing. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I scrolled through my past assignments, logs from shrines, death worlds, and penal colonies, rereading words that used to mean something. Blessed by the Emperor, strength through suffering, faith forged in fire. None of those phrases fit here. This world didn't need faith. It replaced it. I finally wrote a line in my report that I wasn't sure how to justify. Paradise is not the absence of suffering. It is the eradication of awareness that suffering ever existed. I stared at the line for an hour, then deleted it, not because it was wrong, but because it felt like something the system wanted me to write. And I would not let this place teach me how to lie to myself. Not yet. Not while I still remembered what silence was supposed to feel like. The next morning, I took a transport skiff to the outskirts of Aurelia to visit the famed gardens Euphrosyne exported across the segmentum. They were said to produce flowers that never died, never browned, never aged, perfect for imperial shrines, ecclesiarchy processions, and ceremonial regalia across sectors. The transport glided soundlessly over polished roads as citizens walked along the edge, hands folded, eyes closed, heads bowed, but still smiling. I counted them. Every 100 meters, another identical posture, another serene expression, another body in worshipful stillness directed toward nothing visible in the sky above. No one waved at me, no one glanced up. They were not ignoring me. They were simply operating within a different scripted layer of reality. The skiff stopped without me signaling. The servitor pilot gestured wordlessly to the pathway ahead, lined with blue-leafed hedges shaped into looping organic geometry. The air smelled like fresh linen, citrus and soil, but too clean, like a memory of nature rather than the disorder of actual biology. I stepped onto the path, gravel crunching beneath my boots, though the texture didn't match my readings. The gravel didn't show wear or displacement. It reset behind me, like pressure pads smoothing out a carpet, removing evidence that anyone had passed this way, including me. The first gardener greeted me near a spiraling cluster of blood-rose trees, each bloom suspended in mid-opening, petals spread in permanent floral anticipation. She was middle-aged, hair pinned back, expression peaceful, fingers lightly dusted in pollen, though the pollen remained suspended in air, never drifting away. "I'm Lyra," she said, eyes like glass, voice melodic in a way no throat should naturally produce without augmetic assistance or training. "You're the observer." "Chronicler," I replied, correcting her gently, though the term no longer felt accurate. I wasn't sure what I was chronicling anymore. "These are blood roses." "Yes," she said. "This particular cultivar has remained in this precise stage of blooming for 82 years. They do not complete their cycle prematurely." I raised my brow. How is that possible? Even with gene sequencing, cellular decay is inevitable. Hormonal signaling should eventually force full blossom and petal drop. Lyra smiled. "Decay is a choice, and we do not choose it here." She gently touched one of the flowers, and it didn't even tremble. She added, "We preserve what is beautiful, what is whole, what pleases the system. Life must follow form." Her voice never lost its calm cadence. I scanned the plant with a handheld auspex. No change in readings. The petals had identical cellular structure, identical alignment, identical vital signature patterns. It was as if the plant was frozen in time, not dead, not fake, but paused, held within a moment that could not progress forward. I moved on through the gardens, passing through pathways where vines coiled in spirals, never tangled, never overlapping in disorder or organic aggression. Some flowers opened when I passed, releasing a perfect scent of vanilla and spice, as though responding to my presence without visible stimulus or reason. Others remained closed, watching. I know that sounds absurd, but I mean it. Watching, not seeing. The petals tracked me without ever unfolding. In one section, I found a patch of grass shaped into a perfect circle. A girl stood at the center, arms raised to the sky. She didn't speak, didn't flinch, didn't move. I asked the servitor gardener what she was doing. He didn't respond, just turned away and began trimming already perfect shrubs in rhythmic, pointless motions. The girl remained in that pose for the entire 30 minutes I was in the sector, never shifting, never blinking, her mouth slightly parted in silence. When I returned to that spot the next day, she was still there. Same posture, same position, same open mouth, like something had just left it. The garden's irrigation system wasn't mechanical. That was the next anomaly. There were no aqueducts, no pressure regulators, no signs of recycled moisture vapor towers. I asked Lyra about it. She said the water flows when requested. I asked who requests it. The garden, she said without irony or elaboration. I tested the soil. It was hydrated, uniformly. No drying edge, no runoff, no sediment variation. Like the water simply appeared inside the roots on demand. I took a sample and ran a biointegrity test. The water wasn't pure H2O. It was laced with microscopic fibers resembling synthetic nerve tissue strands. When I applied heat, the sample didn't evaporate. It writhed, not like worms, not like bacteria, like it was remembering being part of something. I requested access to the central greenhouse. Klein herself approved it without hesitation. I wasn't sure if that reassured me or terrified me more. She never said no, and perfect hospitality is a kind of spiritual trap. Inside the greenhouse, I found hundreds of species, flora from dozens of worlds perfectly preserved. But some were unidentifiable, unregistered in any imperial taxonomy. One plant pulsed with bioluminescence in sync with my heartbeat. I moved away. Its pulse slowed. I moved closer. It quickened, a mirrored rhythm. Another opened its petals when I spoke aloud, revealing a hollow core that whispered back in a voice matching my own, distorted by distance. I stepped back. The petals closed. I repeated the phrase, "This world is lying to me." The flower repeated it back, but in past tense. This world was lying to me. I touched the petal edge. It was warm, like skin. Then it exhaled. I found the garden ledger in the data terminal nearby. Digital logs dating back nearly 200 years, tracking harvests, bloom cycles, pest suppression events. Only there were no pests, no crop failures, no gaps. The file was continuous, a perfect list of successful bloom entries every day for centuries. The log wasn't an archive, it was a loop. Every 28 entries, the wording repeated verbatim. The only thing that changed was the timestamp. I isolated the sentence structure, ran it through a cognitive pattern algorithm, confirmed, synthetically generated text looped to simulate natural reporting. This wasn't a garden log, it was a cover script. I checked the backup files. Same loop. Local cogitator index, looped. Private terminal, looped. Remote relay, looped. There was no source file, just a shape in the data that repeats itself into being. I closed the logs and turned around. A figure was standing behind the vines, tall, motionless, wearing no uniform, no robes, no name tag, just draped in moss and red-white orchids blooming from their chest like ceremonial armor. Their face was hidden, but I knew they were watching me. I approached slowly. They didn't move. I raised my hand. The vines curled forward, not aggressively, not randomly, like fingers, reaching. Then the figure whispered, "The garden doesn't wilt because it doesn't remember how," and disappeared behind the vines without ever touching the ground. I ran after them. Nothing. Only perfectly undisturbed foliage, no footprints, no crushed stems, no broken pattern. like they had never existed at all, except in the space they'd left behind. That night, I returned to my room and found a flower on my pillow. Not just any flower, one of the never-wilting roses from the garden I'd visited hours before. Its petals were open this time, fully bloomed, which according to the records should be impossible. It had chosen to decay, just for me. A message, but not one I could understand. I touched the edge. It crumbled instantly. The next morning, it was gone. No trace on the sheets, no scent in the air, not even a memory in the hotel staff logs. Except for me, I still remembered it. And I was starting to fear that remembering anything was how you got noticed. On the 5th day of my assignment, I walked to the edge of the orchard sector alone, where the trees grew too symmetrically. They weren't mirrored in a natural way, not like roots fighting for space or light. They were placed, spaced, aligned with surgical mathematics. Each trunk bore identical bark textures. The knots were in the same position. Every leaf shimmered the same shade of green when sunlight touched them. I tried to find imperfections, a broken twig, a bruised fruit, a patch of disrupted soil, but the ground looked freshly printed, untouched. It felt like I was standing on a painting, not one made of color, but memory, repeated until the brushstrokes faded into illusionary depth. I leaned down, pressing my palm to the soil, expecting warmth from the midday light, but the ground was unnaturally cold, like vacuum metal. I dug with my fingers just a few centimeters. Beneath the perfect top layer was black loam, dense and moist, and then bone white. It wasn't rock, not clay, not root. It was skull, the curve unmistakable, almost polished, as if time had sanded down identity but preserved the shape that once held memory. And then I heard it. A voice from below. Not a groan, not a whisper, a question. Do you remember planting me? I stumbled back, heart kicking against my ribs, auspex rattling on my belt, fingers still wet from soil that wasn't just dirt anymore. The voice wasn't in my head. I know the difference. It came through the ground like vibration, like communication traveling through carbon resonance. I stared at the spot. The soil was already smoothed over. No hole, no dent, no evidence I'd touched it at all. I opened the auspex. It had recorded a sound spike, a single blip, deep frequency, untagged by Vox classification. I isolated it, looped it. It wasn't just noise. It was language pressed into the waveform, but not in high Gothic, not in low Gothic, not even in binaric. It was in data organic, a forbidden hybrid dialect used by Dark Mechanicum decades ago during the Jericho malcontent. I played it once more, and I swear on the Emperor's name, it laughed the 3rd time I looped it. I returned to Prefect Klein. She offered tea. I declined. Who is buried beneath the orchards? I asked. No one, she said, smile unbroken. This world is free of death. Then why did the soil answer me? I asked. Why did it speak in a language the Mechanicum considers heresy? Klein tilted her head, as if examining an outburst from a child. Not hostile, just disappointing in its predictability. Your question assumes directionality, she said. It assumes that the ground lies beneath us and that we walk upon it. I stared. What does that even mean? She responded, here, the soil remembers forward. We are what it has already decided to grow. She sipped her tea. Do not mistake the fruit for the seed. You are not here to investigate. You are here to be bloomed. I left. I didn't run. That would have drawn attention, and I was starting to realize attention was the most dangerous thing here. I sent a secure Vox to Segmentum Command that evening, encrypting it under the silent choir clearance level, reserved for reality breaches and warp anomalies. But when I checked the transmission log afterward, it said, message confirmed, delivered to Euphrosyne archives. No external relay, no outbound transmission, just a perfect circle. Like the Vox only loops internally, never reaching beyond the planet's own mirrored infrastructure. I tried again using my personal back channel, routing through a void-borne frequency. Same result. Delivered to Euphrosyne archives. I disabled the comms array and stared at the silent green light blinking back at me. Not malicious, not corrupted, just complicit. I returned to the orchard under cover of darkness. Not full night. There was no true night on Euphrosyne. The sun dimmed to artificial dusk, but the sky never turned black. The trees glowed faintly. Bioluminescent pollen drifted like dust motes in air too still to carry it. I brought a shovel, manual, steel. No electronics. I dug again, this time deeper, a full meter down. The first layer fell away easily, the second pulsed with heat. The third moved. Not like worms, not like insects, like lungs. The dirt swelled and contracted, breathing, slow, patient, ancient. And then it spoke again. You are not the first seed. This time, the voice wasn't external. It came through the shovel, up the shaft, vibrating into my wrists and bones like a sermon whispered in iron. I dropped the tool and stepped back. The hole I'd dug was already closing. The soil reknit itself like skin repairing under heat and pressure. In less than 60 seconds, the ground was smooth again. I marked the spot, returned the next day. It was gone. Not just the hole. The tree itself. The whole row was gone, replaced with young saplings I hadn't seen before, each one with pale red stems shaped like digits, hands blooming from earth, reaching upward. No roots, no trunk, just fingers. I ran a bioscan on the saplings. The cellular structure was human, not entirely, hybridized, modified, but unmistakably built from human DNA strands intermixed with organic processor sequences. I submitted the data to the archives. 2 hours later, the file was gone. In its place, a text file, one line. Let the soil speak, let the seed forget. I began to dream of dirt, not darkness, not burial, but depth, pressure, memory growing upward instead of downward. In the dreams, I heard names, hundreds of them. None I recognized. Some were numbers. Others were sounds that had no phonetic match in Gothic speech. I asked a local priest, one of the few I found praying instead of smiling. He told me the gardens were blessed by the emperor. I asked what rites were performed to bless them. He laughed once, not joyfully, not cruelly, just one hollow bark, like a man who couldn't explain why his own hands were missing. When he raised his robes, I saw it. No hands, no arms, just bark. Real, fibrous bark, fused into muscle and tendon. His arms ended in branches. Where his wrists should have been, small yellow flowers bloomed, slowly, rhythmically, pulsing in time with his voice. He didn't seem surprised or afraid, just resigned. I prayed for peace, he said, and the soil heard me. Now I am peace. He knelt in the dirt. The ground opened, welcomed him, swallowed him, like the earth knew exactly where to place him. The spot closed. Another sapling grew there the next morning, its branches shaped like folded hands. I've stopped asking questions publicly. They only rewrite the answers. Instead, I leave notes hidden in the orchard, carved beneath the bark of trees, written in litanies only the faithful would understand. But they always vanish. The bark heals, the soil forgets. Except sometimes when I dream, I see those same words, glowing underneath the surface, still alive in the roots. The trees remember, the ground speaks, the seed is not innocent. And I'm starting to think, and I wasn't sent here to observe this place. I was planted. I sat in the atrium of the Ministry of Wellness, beneath stained glass murals depicting saints whose faces I didn't recognize anymore. The glass was too clean, too precise, and the light filtering through cast hues that didn't match any known spectrum in my auspex. Every ray of colored light seemed to delay its fall, as if choosing where to land, like it had a personal intent or memory. The others seated around me, citizens waiting for spiritual alignment assessments, sat with hands folded neatly, back straight, eyes forward, and smiles that never shifted an inch. Not polite smiles, not strained or joyful, just a fixed crescent of lip and tooth, timeless, effortless, not reacting to noise or motion or stimulus. I made a noise, a fake cough, a shifted boot heel, a deliberate sigh, but none of them flinched or turned or even blinked in response. It was like they were playing a scene on repeat, like actors who'd forgotten how to improvise when a cue fell out of rhythm. The man beside me wore a robe marked with a cogwheel emblem, yet the machine-etched lines on his face didn't pulse like normal bioaugmetics. Instead, they shimmered, like wet ink beneath wax paper. shifting in and out of phase whenever I looked too long or tilted my head slightly. Eventually, a woman stepped through a doorway marked Inner Balance Consultations. She beckoned me without speaking. Her teeth showed when she smiled, but her eyes didn't change. Not one wrinkle moved with expression. Her voice was smooth, melodic, untextured, like a voice box imitating what someone thought comforting tone should sound like, but without any emotional current behind it. "You are our honored guest," she said, tone perfectly flat. "Come with me. Let us restore the pieces that are already whole." I asked no questions. I walked into the chamber behind her, my feet moving more from habit than trust, more out of necessity than certainty. Inside, the walls weren't walls. They were shaped light, boundaries made of focused projection, like sanctified hololithic illusions pretending to be a room's architecture. There were no shadows here. My boots didn't echo. My breath didn't fog, even though I could feel the coldness of the sterile, empty air. The chair at the center was curved, organic, metallic in sheen, but too warm to be steel, shaped like it was grown rather than forged. I sat. The smiling woman took out a small orb. She placed it on the floor. It began to hum, a slow, rising tremor, like the breath of something ancient awakening from dormancy. The light shifted to pale gold. The floor beneath my feet softened. The chair curled slightly around my spine, mimicking muscle support like an old friend. Then she asked the question, "When did you last feel welcome?" It wasn't hostile. It wasn't inquisitive. It wasn't even curious. It was precise, surgical, a word knife, sharpened by something that knew which part of the soul would flinch first. I said nothing. The room waited with her, not in awkward silence, but in absolute complicit stillness. I looked up. The stained glass ceiling above us began to show movement. Not metaphor, not illusion, real movement. Saints stepping down from their panels, walking through the glass. Their robes didn't flutter, their eyes didn't blink, but they smiled. They all smiled. I turned back to the woman. Her mouth still wore that smile, but her teeth were wrong now. Too white, too many, too evenly spaced, like dental replication done from a single sample, over and over, regardless of original anatomy. I asked her if she knew Prefect Klein. She nodded. "All joys begin in the same place." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means the shape of peace is recursive," she said, smile widening by a millimeter. "And recursion always finds you, eventually." I asked to leave. She said I was already outside. Back at my quarters, the mirror didn't reflect me correctly, not backwards, not delayed. It smiled before I did. When I frowned, it held the grin. When I looked away, it blinked once, just once, and then stilled itself like nothing had ever changed. I turned the mirror to face the wall. It laughed, audibly, a short, dry giggle that sounded exactly like my voice, but squeezed through a throat that hadn't used lungs in years. I smashed it with my boot. The shards bled light, not color, not plasma, not heat, light, raw and bright, and full of whispered phrases I couldn't hear. The next morning, the mirror was whole again. No cracks, no blood, no signs of damage. But the reflection was no longer smiling. It was screaming, silently, forever. I went to the hospital district. Surely someone here wasn't smiling. Surely pain, illness, or grief must exist in some pocket too stubborn to be pruned away completely. I walked past trauma wards, maternity centers, elderly hospice buildings. Every patient smiled, every nurse smiled, every corpse smiled, yes, even the dead. A covered body wheeled past me on an anti-grav stretcher. I pulled the sheet. The face beneath was perfectly preserved, lips frozen in peaceful joy. But the eyes were gone, not gouged, not surgically removed, just absent, as if the sockets had never developed the organ to begin with. The corpse had a name tag, Observer A. Vel, my own name, my rank, my designation, my clearance code. I staggered back. No one noticed. Or worse, they did and didn't care because the script had no contingency for a character refusing to accept their own death scene. I demanded to see Prefect Klein. No waiting this time. The building rearranged itself to lead me to her directly, walls folding, Doors vanishing, corridors narrowing and expanding as if breathing me inward. She was waiting, hands folded, face composed, smile immaculate. Behind her, an enormous sculpture made of teeth, human teeth, all smiling. I asked her why everyone here smiles. She said, because sorrow was the first infection and smiles are the inoculation. I asked why the dead smile. She said, because paradise does not forget its shape. Even in rot, joy remains. I asked if the mirror was lying. She said, no. The mirror is simply remembering too early. I asked if the corpse was me. She paused, then she said, perhaps. Or perhaps it's a reflection you'll need later. Either way, smile. It's how the soil tells who's ready. I left. Her teeth did not change, her eyes never blinked, the room never moved. But something behind the walls leaned forward and followed me all the way out. Back in the street, I tried to fake a smile. My jaw resisted. I hadn't smiled in days, maybe longer. It hurt. The muscles didn't remember how. I looked around, all of them, smiling, not walking, just standing, lined across the boulevard. Hundreds, thousands, eyes closed, mouths open, silent, smiling. One of them whispered, "Don't forget to smile when the soil comes for you. It only takes the willing." Then the whole crowd blinked in perfect unison. Their heads tilted in perfect unison. Their teeth shifted into shapes that did not belong in the human skull. I locked my doors that night. I taped the mirror. I burned the flower that grew from my sink. And still, when I closed my eyes, I dreamed of smiling, not with my face, with my soul. And something else smiled back, from underneath the garden, from inside the mirrors, from behind Prefect Klein's eyes, from inside my teeth. I woke to the sound of digging, not above me, not outside, from underneath my bed. It wasn't frantic, like someone trying to escape. It was slow, patient, deliberate, each scrape measured, as if following some unseen ritual cadence. I held my breath. The sound didn't stop. Instead, it matched the rhythm of my heartbeat, adjusting as my pulse quickened, sinking itself like a predator's breathing before a strike. When I moved my hand to the last pistol on my nightstand, the digging stopped entirely. Then, from beneath the floorboards, a whisper rose, drawn out, clear. "We've already made your place." I didn't sleep again that night. Morning came in the artificial sunrise Euphrosyne projected into the sky. The light felt heavier today, thick, almost wet, like something pushing back against my skin rather than illuminating it. When I looked out my window, the garden below had changed shape overnight. The paths were no longer straight lines between fruit trees. They curved inward now, spiraling toward a center I couldn't see. The people walking them all moved the same way, slow, careful, measured steps, as though avoiding invisible traps laid just beneath the grass. Every one of them smiled, and as they passed each tree, they pressed their hands to the soil in perfect unison. I left my quarters and headed toward Prefect Klein's administrative hall, but I didn't get far. Halfway down the street, the ground shifted beneath my boots. Not enough to topple me, just enough to suggest the earth was adjusting my position. A merchant waved to me from a nearby stall. His stall sold nothing. The shelves were empty. Still, he smiled wide, showing teeth blackened with soil, packed into the gums like roots. "Fresh stock soon," he said, even though there was nothing to restock. "From where?" I asked. "From you," he answered. At the archives, I tried to access my original arrival log to confirm the date I'd landed here. The system denied access, not due to clearance level, but because no such file existed. The next query I made pulled up an entry, Observer A, Vel, date of planting, classified planting. Not arrival, not assignment, not transfer, planting. I checked the personnel records for my team. All listed as harvested or seeded, no death dates, no cause of death, just those two words. I took the underground transit toward the orchard sector again, planning to verify what lay beneath those trees in daylight. But halfway through the tunnel, the train slowed to a stop. Lights flickered. The carriage was empty except for me. A faint scratching sound came from the ceiling, like nails dragging against thin metal from above. The noise moved slowly toward the carriage door, then stopped. A voice spoke, muffled through the paneling. "We don't bury to hide. We bury to remember. When the lights returned, the train was moving again. At the next station, the platform was covered in soil, not scattered, poured, like someone had upended 1,000 graves to make the ground here soft enough to swallow anything standing still too long. In the orchard sector, Prefect Klein was waiting. She didn't look surprised to see me. "You've been restless," she said. "You've been digging," I replied. Her smile deepened slightly, enough to show an extra tooth where there hadn't been one yesterday. "We are gardeners," she said, "and you are the only one who still pretends to be the seed and not the soil." I asked what was buried here. She tilted her head, almost pitying. "Nothing is buried here. Everything is growing." I told her I'd heard voices in the dirt. She nodded. "Yes, the soil is memory, and memory speaks to its own. You have simply begun to hear your roots." I told her I had no roots here. She smiled again. "Not anymore, but soon." I left her and went deeper into the orchards, far enough that the symmetry of the trees began to fail. Here, the ground was uneven, sloping into shallow depressions. Each depression was filled with a pale, fibrous mat, too thick to be moss, too soft to be stone. I knelt and touched it. It was hair, human hair, growing in a perfect circle from the soil. A wind passed through the trees then, though no clouds moved in the sky. The hair rippled with it, like grass, and in the movement I heard my own name, whispered in the same voice that had spoken beneath my bed. "Your place is ready." Back in the city, I began to notice changes in myself. My nails grew faster, darker, more brittle. When I cut them, the clippings bled, not red, but brown, like wet compost. The skin on my palms roughened, the lines deepening into patterns I didn't recognize. Spirals, branching curves, lattice grids like root systems. At night, my dreams placed me underground, not suffocating, but suspended in a space that pulsed with warmth and whispered in steady rhythm. In the dreams, I was not afraid. In the dreams, I was smiling. 3 days later, a funeral procession passed my quarters. No casket, just 6 robed figures carrying a block of soil between them. The soil was wet. It dripped onto the street as they walked. From the top of the block, a single pale hand jutted out, twitching rhythmically. I followed them to the orchard's edge. They placed the soil block into a prepared pit and covered it without ceremony. The twitching stopped only when the last shovelful fell. One of the robed figures turned to me then, as though sensing my presence through the crowd. I couldn't see their face beneath the hood, but their teeth glinted in the shadow. "We'll see you soon," they said. That night, I didn't lock my door. I wanted to know what would happen if I stopped resisting. At 2:13, the digging started again beneath the floorboards. This time, I didn't move. I let the rhythm match my breathing until I couldn't tell if I was inhaling or the soil was. The boards softened beneath me, sinking ever so slightly with each exhale, as if the ground was adjusting to fit my shape perfectly. When I finally moved to stand, my legs didn't respond. The bed was lower now, sunken into the floor. So was I. From the darkness below came the voice again, closer this time. "We don't have to bury you. You're already here." The day after the soil whispered my name and the mirrors rehearsed my smile, I requested unrestricted archive access under Administratum Article Sigma Remembrance, claiming urgent historiographic reconciliation for imperial census harmonization. Prefect Klein approved it immediately, which frightened me more than denial, because instant permission here always felt like a door that had already decided my destination. Aurelia's grand archive did not resemble any librarium I had catalogued. There were no dust motes, no sallow-sleeved adepts coughing over vellum, no restless servo-scribes muttering. Instead, the entrance opened into air so clean it tasted medicinal, hallways lit by patient lumen veins and stacks that curved in gentle, persuasive spirals. Shelves wore no titles, books bore no spines, and tablets arranged themselves in families of color rather than subject, the categories feeling oddly empathic and responsive. The attendant at the threshold smiled that too-perfect smile and said nothing, simply lifted a hand in a gesture that felt exactly like permission already given. I walked until the geometry stopped making sense, turning corners that should have returned me to the foyer, but instead announced new corridors without architectural transitions. The temperature dropped by a fractional degree with every dozen steps, the sort of environmental shift you notice in vaults designed to preserve fragile official memory. My data slate pulsed with coordinates that drifted as if the archive were politely refusing cartography, the way a cat moves just beyond a beaded curtain. At a junction where two aisles braided like rivers taught by mathematicians, I found a desk that should not have existed, made of bone-white cellulose and silk. An old man sat behind it, lean as a quill, beard trimmed with monastic indecision, eyes the color of wet ink, and smile notably absent from his face. He did not stand, but his posture showed welcome without civility, a carven grace learned in places where books outrank bishops and footfalls disturb sleeping saints. "Welcome, chronicler," he said, voice gravel varnished by years of quiet, and the words relieved me because they finally contained texture, not the archive's obsessive smoothness. "I am Veren, sub-archivist by exile, remissionary scribe, precinct custodian of what remains unwritten, and occasional nuisance when Paradise forgets to fear librarians properly." The title Exile snagged my attention like a blackthorn. Exiles do not typically man public desks, and yet here he sat, unguarded, unbeheld, alarmingly unharmonized. "You were sent to me," he continued, and I nearly said Klein's name, but he raised a thin palm and added, "Not by her, not by them, by it." "What it?" I asked, and the shelves behind him shivered almost imperceptibly, a tremor that suggested embarrassment rather than draft, like the archive blushed under scrutiny. "The loop," he said simply, as if mentioning rain, then stacked 3 tablets that had not been there a moment earlier, each labeled with my designation sigil. "Explain without reciting catechism," I said, because everyone else here loved catechism, and he rewarded the rudeness with a humorless smirk full of living human fatigue. "Paradise is a story that refuses to end," Veren said, sliding the first tablet toward me. "So it uses you to rewrite its middle until your hands agree." I resisted the tablet for a heartbeat, because compulsion hides best inside truth-shaped packages, then touched the surface and watched characters appear before actually carving themselves. The header read "Arrival at Euphrosyne, Vel," followed by paragraphs I recognized verbatim from my private notes, including sentences I had deleted before saving any drafts. I scrolled and found descriptions of orchards, the perfect bell harmonics, the boy named Welcome, and my line about Paradise charging, costs you had not learned seeing. "Somebody has access to my slate," I said, but even as the accusation formed, I tasted its inadequacy, because the margin notes included thoughts I never typed anywhere. "That tablet is not a copy," Veren said, folding hands that looked more like bookmarks than bones. "It is a version, one of the loop's favorite rehearsal scripts. The loop learns us," he added, then asks us to like what it writes, then congratulates us for agreeing, and finally claims our agreement proves its benevolence. "You're suggesting consciousness capture," I said, hearing myself reach for Mechanicus. Language, because theological terms have too much polite furniture for rooms like this. "I'm suggesting a garden that prunes the gardener," Veren answered, and the second tablet slid forward as if nudged by a librarian mistrusting human speed. This one displayed an earlier version of my assignment, dated 8 years prior, filled with identical observations, nearly identical phrases, and a closing line begging terror for exemption. The signature was mine, the cadence mine, the fear mine, except for 2 devastating differences. The words "request denied," administrative dead letter, stamped across the footer. "Did I send this?" I asked, too softly, feeling the archive's air grow heavier, like paper on the tongue, when absolutions go unswallowed for long enough. "You sent many," Veren replied, not kindly and not cruelly, simply filing a truth in me with the finality of a docket closing around a name. "The loop resets, chronicler, but it never deletes. It piles us in neat stacks until we agree our repetition is proof of destiny rather than design." "How did you avoid the smile?" I asked, because his mouth still refused the civic crescent, and the absence was beautiful, like an icon missing guilt, but not gravity. "I didn't," he said, and he smiled for the first time. A ghastly, brittle baring of teeth that looked like a rehearsal forgotten halfway, then set aside forever. The face remembers the shape long after the heart resigns, he added, letting the smile fall off again like a leaf that regretted summer too late. Paradise disciplines the jaw before it disciplines the will. Musculoskeletal catechism precedes metaphysical consent because the body is easier to bribe than conscience. He tapped the third tablet, and the room's lumen veins dimmed, not into darkness, but into a more honest, archived dusk that knew how shadows sharpen meaning. The tablet showed continuity compact, original draft, clauses crossed by red edits, margins filled with notes in 3 distinct hands, one of which I recognized as mine. Clause 7 read, "Remembrance events will recur monthly or upon administrative convenience. Backdating permitted, attendees considered present regardless of personal recollection or recorded attendance." That clause writes the purity rights into our past whenever the system needs precedent, Varen said, and his voice cracked on our as if it weighed more today. The rights are not scheduled. The rights are applied retroactively. Forgetting is not failure here. Forgetting is proof you participated correctly and loved the result sufficiently. I remembered the plaza hymns, the archival footnote that renamed burial gardens, and the civic calendar where prayer disguised itself as recollection, not supplication or petition. "You called this a loop," I said, trying to anchor abstraction to machinery. "Is it a religious recursion, an administrative engine, a warp cogitator hybrid, or all together?" Varen lifted a quill that had not been on the desk previously and pointed it at my chest with the ceremonial disrespect of a threatened librarian. "It is you," he said, not theatrically, not mystically, but like a clerk announcing the line had closed, leaving one petitioner blinking before signage nobody reads carefully. Euphrosyne copies its guests' chronicler. It copies them until the copy stops arguing with the copyist. Then it plants that agreement where dissent once lived. "That is how the gardens never wilt," he added, the quill trembling in a hand that preferred books to speeches. "The soil is covenant paper, composted with consent." I thought of the hair circles breathing like grass, the priest with bark for arms, and the funeral without a casket where wet earth twitched like prayer. "Why tell me?" I asked, because warnings here felt like ceremonial knives, more beautiful than useful, more clarifying than survivable, and honesty wastes breath under velvet ceilings. "Because you still write sentences, then delete them," Varen said, "and the loop prefers authors who trust every draft. Your hesitation is a splinter it cannot smooth." He beckoned me closer, eyes gleaming the way oil lamps gleam when chapel's empty, a shine that protects paper rather than the pious trudging through cold. "Your reports return as orientation pamphlets," he whispered, and the word orientation sounded suddenly obscene. Each iteration shorter, shinier, kinder, until nobody remembers they once contained warnings. I grimaced, because I have trimmed my own sentences to appease superiors, and those trimmings always grew back elsewhere as weeds disguised like manners. "Show me the oldest loop you possess," I said, and Varen nodded with a grief that did not perform itself, then opened a drawer that did not exist beforehand. He lifted a codex bound in pale leather that looked disturbingly like cured palm, stamped with an aquila reduced to decorative filigree rather than sacred jurisdiction. Inside, the first page bore a name I recognized from a dead archive in the Halo Marches, a chronicler whose disappearance had been marked personal cowardice. The text began with wonder, drifted into doubt, sharpened into fear, and finally flattened into piety so sudden the paragraph break felt like a snapped spine. The final line read, "Rejoice, for the Emperor's will has made our joy unending, and my concerns were an old man's misfiled dusk." In the margin below, written in a different hand so faint it hid between paper fibers, I read, "I didn't write that last sentence." The archive exhaled, not pleased and not angry, simply disappointed. I had found the needle that pricks hospitality's silk and lets a single drop escape. "Who changed it?" I asked, and Varen's eyes flicked to the shelves, then back, the way a priest glances at a reliquary when the relics start perspiring. The same librarian who files your dreams on the nightstand, he said, which was unhelpful until I remembered water glasses appearing and condensation traveling predetermined paths. Continuity edits, he added, a bureaucracy older than itself, whose only scripture is footnotes, whose only heresy is endings, whose only sacraments are smiles. And you remain here, unsmiling, unedited, I said, because his posture still belonged to a human, too tired for ecstasies and too proud for anesthesia without consent. I remain because the archive needs a keeper who remembers misshelved titles, he said, and because sometimes paradise forgets to lock the whispering stacks after vespers. He stood then, joints popping like type bars in a machine older than the paper it stains, and gestured for me to follow him deeper into the spiral. We passed alcoves where tablets breathed like sleeping animals, cabinets that clicked gently as if reluctant to confess the letters hiding in their hinged spines. A narrow door admitted us into a chamber whose walls were slate, etched floor to ceiling with columns of names, dates, and verdicts that refused legibility from distance. Up close, the inscriptions slid away from focus, like ink recoiling from the eye, but I could still sense structures, verdict shapes, the architecture of forever decisions. Continuity Court, Veron said, and the title made my teeth ache the way cheap candied fruit aches gums, sweet hiding vinegar behind festival ribbons. Cases of deviation, accusations of grief, petitions for permission to remember pain correctly, motions to allow endings when blossoms insist on agelessness. Who serves as judge? I asked, because titling courts requires judges, and he inhaled the way librarians inhale before defying both bishops and storm shutters simultaneously. The court is the judge, he said, and the court never closes because remembrance petitions arrive every time a human throat refuses the smile for breath. He pointed toward a dais that held no chair, no gavel, only a polished slab where reflections might gather and vote quietly on how to proceed. Stand there, he instructed softly, and ask what you came to ask when you first saw the clouds refuse to wobble for your benefit. I stood on the slab, which was colder than the archive's air, and asked aloud, what happened to those who rejected the loop before me? The slate walls did not move, but a faint chalk whisper feathered my ears, and a phrase materialized where my eyes failed to anchor focus. Recalled to joy, it wrote itself, then replanted through a chord, then corrected by ceremony, and finally dismissed as recording artifact, which is bureaucratic for they are an error. The words faded before outrage could fix them, and my outrage felt domesticated anyway, like anger on velvet, petable and purring instead of breaking furniture. Do you see? Veron asked, and I admitted I only saw names becoming mulch for euphemisms, a jurisprudence that trimmed conclusions until blossoms looked obedient again. He placed a small token in my hand, a disc the size of a coin, embossed with an aquila whose wings had been smoothed into curves. Carry this, he said. It marks you as a reader, not a participant, and sometimes the loop trips when distinguishing the two, hesitating long enough to breathe. What is it made of? I asked, because composition matters in talismans. Some bind with silver, others with vows, many with nothing except somebody's desperate attentiveness. Regret, he said, and the coin felt heavier, cold seeping past palm lines like ink exploring the grammar of a page that never asked permission. Whose regret? I asked, and he gave the sort of shrug men give when admissions could topple ladders they have stood upon for 30 very patient years. Mine, yours, the boy named Welcome, the priest with bark wrists, the woman you trusted before she learned to love the smile more than sleep. We returned to the desk where the 3 tablets waited, but a 4th now lay beside them, unmarked, its surface grey like unawakened slate. It will open when you do not look, Veron said, confirming my worst habit from Hiveshrike, where books loved readers who blinked with curiosity rather than hunger. Turn away and ask yourself privately why you really came, and the answer will write itself, though you will hate its handwriting more than truth. I turned my head toward a shelf labeled with nothing except the patient smell of paper, and in that small surrender, I heard thin stylus scratching behind me. "Read," Veron urged, and I obeyed, because even a proud chronicler learns to kneel when a page performs miracles he cannot file under routine providence. The tablet displayed a single line at first, then three, then a paragraph that arranged itself into a sentence I had never permitted my mouth to pronounce. I came because I was tired of endings that bled, and I wanted one that slept without grief disturbing the sheets anymore. The words made me furious, because they were correct, and fury at accuracy is the most honest heat, the one that peels varnish from oaths efficiently. "You see why the loop likes you," Veron said, not taunting, not fathering, simply laying a ledger across my conscience and drawing a line through any remaining excuses. "It can sell you mercy, while costing you particularity. It can borrow the shape of your longing and invoice you with smiles, payable upon surrender." I set the tablet down gently, then not gently, then too gently again, because anger here always arrived with padding, like sharp things mailed in nursery packaging. "What breaks it?" I asked, and his pause contained both sorrow and a librarian's meticulous malice toward cages disguised as tasteful reading rooms with endemic sunlight. "Misfiled memory," he said, "stood in the wrong section long enough that the attendants cannot find it to correct the index, because the index worships itself." He reached beneath the desk, withdrew a thin codical ribbon etched with microscript, and wrapped it around my wrist with an intimacy that felt almost priestly. "When you witness the purity rites," he whispered, "refuse to stand where your name directs. Stand where a stranger should, and remember what you did afterward. The loop will try to retrofit your standing into the proper place, but misshelved people squeak, and sometimes the squeak distracts the smile long enough to blink." I tucked the coin and ribbon into my sleeve, thanked him with a nod that learned from old abbots rather than new prefects, and turned to leave the spiral. "Chronicler," Veron called, and when I faced him again, his eyes had softened into the fragile bravery of men who keep lamps under seas for strangers. "When you cannot find me," he said, "do not ask where I went. Ask what shelf smells suddenly like rain, and leave me there without correcting the title." I tried to commit his features to the obstinate part of memory that resists all curators, cataloguers, and compassionate erasers with gold pens and liturgical smiles forever. Then I stepped into the aisle and discovered the archive had rearranged the route, but the coin in my sleeve warmed, and a corridor tolerated my departure unharmonized. The foyer welcomed me with the same silent attendant and the same gracious air. Beyond the doors, the plaza rehearsed yesterday's joy to the proper beat again. Yet for a breath, a hairline crack appeared in that beat, a missed clap or tardy bow, and the smiles wavered like pages turning into wind briefly. On the balcony that evening, I placed the unmarked tablet on the rail and looked deliberately at the suns while asking my heart for unpublishable answers. A faint scratching rewarded the stupidity of honesty. When I glanced down, a single sentence had carved itself there, spare as winter fruit and twice as true. "If you remain long enough, you will write the brochure," it warned, and a second line followed with cruelty that wore the robe of sweetness expertly, "and you will mean every word." The orchard below curled its spiral a fraction tighter. The gardeners turned as one toward a center I could not see, and my jaw ached, refusing choreography. Across the plaza, a lit window flickered inside the archive's upper galleries, then darkened, then lit again with the particular yellow of a lamp defying regulations. I raised the coin to my lips like a sainted relic and whispered a promise I am ashamed a little to have enjoyed phrasing clearly. "I will misfile myself," I said, and the coin cooled, and the mirror over my bed waited, and the soil under the floor rehearsed the shape of welcome. Far away, bells hinted at tomorrow's purity rites without admitting dates, because dates obey clocks, and the clocks here learn new hours whenever remembrance requires applause. I slept badly, and badly here meant honestly, twitching through dreams that resisted editorial smoothing, and in one of them Veron shelved my heart underweathered. When dawn arrived with its immaculate blue agreements, I rose, washed, dressed, and practiced a smile in the mirror that might pass until misfiling could begin appropriately. Citizens already streamed toward the forum in arrangements labelled by some invisible clerk, and I felt the ribbon under my cuff, and I stepped toward the wrong row. A child rolled a hoop across my path, circle-cleaving air with smug perfection, and as he passed, he whispered without moving lips, "Readers get planted slower. Remember, carefully." I did not look down at the coin again because talismans require dignity as much as faith, and dignity demands we pretend we needed no charms whatsoever. When the first bell chimed, it stumbled, and only I seemed to hear it. When the crowd paused, I kept walking. When smiles widened, mine loosened. Between one heartbeat and the next, I saw Veron's lamp extinguish across the square, and I understood the archive had filed him under completed without witnesses. I whispered his name into the place under my tongue, where profanity and prayer shake hands, promising to misremember him precisely where correction cannot politely reach. Above us, clouds arranged themselves into the Emperor's Aquila, then into a simpler bracket, as if punctuation might suffice where theology would only complicate obedience. The second bell struck true, the plaza inhaled, and the purity rites began without beginning, like a sentence that deletes its capital letter while continuing flawlessly onward forever. I stood where a stranger should stand, and the world noticed as gently as a librarian snapping shut a book that was due 2 centuries earlier than anyone admitted. Somewhere below, the soil revised its invitation. Somewhere above, mirrors practiced my hesitation. Somewhere within, the coin weighed me like remorse, and the ribbon quietly remembered rain. If an archivist must warn, then let the warning bear a librarian's precision, not a priest's thunder. Euphrosyne is not lying, it is editing, and you are draft. If a chronicler must confess, then let the confession be grammatical cruelty. I came here to sleep without endings. The loop offers that sleep, interest compounded eternally. I promise to misfile myself until somebody trips over me and swears, and by that small profanity lets oxygen enter a sentence, otherwise deliciously, dangerously perfect forever. The bells sang their third note. The smiles reached the preferred radius, and the plaza tilted imperceptibly toward agreement, but my feet remembered a wrong shelf stubbornly. When the officiant lifted hands and called the rite a recollection, I recalled a future instead, and the loop shivered with the discomfort of a reader refusing closure. Veron, wherever they stored your lamp, know this. The coin is cold again, which means it trusts me. The ribbon is damp, which means rain rescheduled memory tonight. The archive doors closed behind an air that smelled faintly of lightning despite clear skies, and the plaza resembled a page that suspects someone penciled a margin joke. Tomorrow I will look for Forbidden Sector Omega, and if it behaves like a footnote afraid of being cited, I will cite it twice in anger. If the loop smiles, I will show my teeth back without curving the lips, and if continuity courts me, I will plead misplacement until the gavel misfires. Until then, Chronicler A. Vel records this. The rogue scribe's warning stands. Paradise is a loop, but loops not where misfiled readers insist on walking the wrong shelves deliberately. Midnight arrived on Euphrosyne without the dignity of darkness. Because the suns did not dim, they simply forgot to move. The plaza lay awash in gold, as if dawn had been caught halfway through a sigh, refusing to complete the breath. Shadows no longer stretched long and cautious. They curled beneath objects like polite pets, perfectly symmetrical regardless of where I stood. The bells had stopped after the purity rites, but the air carried the faint metallic hum of something maintaining this endless afternoon. I checked my chrono for reassurance, but the display looped the same minute over and over, a patient repetition that mocked seconds. Windows glowed in every building, but not from candles or lumen strips. The light was identical to the sun above, seamless and depthless. A woman across the street was hanging laundry that did not move in the still air, each sheet perfectly vertical like a gallery display. She smiled when I looked, her lips holding the civic curve, but her eyes fixed somewhere past me, as if reading an unseen teleprompter. Beyond her, the orchards shimmered faintly, leaves catching gold from an angle that should not exist. like paintings illuminated by a source outside the frame. Even the birds, those pale, perfect creatures, continued to wheel in slow, mechanical arcs, never dipping or veering, as if the air itself had chosen their choreography. I tried to walk toward the horizon to find the sun's anchor point, but every street folded back into the plaza inevitably. The paving stones beneath my boots repeated in patterns too exact for human laying. No cracks, no moss, no scars from weather or use. Occasionally I passed a citizen pausing mid-step, eyes flickering, before resuming their motion without adjusting pace, as if a hand had rewound them half a second. The coin in my sleeve felt warmer now, almost impatient, and I realized that whatever this was, it did not like observers. Above, the suns, both of them, burned steady in a position that mocked astronomical charts, locked directly overhead, never inching toward horizon or zenith. I remembered Veron's words about misfiling myself, and wondered whether time here was a shelf and someone had placed the hour in the wrong section. If midnight could wear sunlight, then perhaps morning could wear night, and days could be archived according to emotional content rather than planetary rotation. A thought came unbidden. The loop does not measure time, it edits it until the version pleases the narrative. As I moved, my shadow stopped following me, lagging several steps behind, its delay a quiet rebellion against the perfect choreography around me. I halted, and it caught up too quickly, stretching unnaturally before snapping back under me with the audible snap of parchment folding. That was when I saw the child again, the same boy named Welcome, standing beneath a lamp that had no flame yet shone with the sun's gold. He lifted his hoop, but instead of rolling it, he simply let it hover in the air between us, suspended without string. "You're not supposed to see this hour," he said, his voice lower than before, stripped of the false innocence from the orchard. "This is editing time," he added, and the hoop rotated slowly, its shadow rotating in the opposite direction along the cobblestones. "What happens if I stay?" I asked, the words tasting metallic in my mouth, like I had bitten a coin I didn't own. "You'll believe it was night," he said, "and you'll wake with stories about moons and dreams that never happened, because midnight is expensive to remember here." His eyes flicked to the coin under my sleeve, and I noticed that his shadow did not exist at all in the perfect sunlight. "Who edits it?" I pressed, but he smiled, an honest smile this time, without the enforced curvature, and whispered, "You do, eventually." The hoop fell to the ground with no sound, rolled perfectly once, then stopped against my boot as if awaiting adoption. When I looked up, the boy was gone, leaving only a ripple in the light above the lamp, like water disturbed in a glass dome. I returned to my quarters, but the mirror above the bed was glowing faintly, not with reflection, but with the same sunlight trapped outside. My reflection stood in place, but its lips moved independently, speaking words I could not hear, the glass muting sound like a page without ink. The chrono still displayed the same looping minute, but I realized the ticking sound had ceased entirely, as if even the illusion of passing time was unnecessary. Outside the plaza continued its eternal afternoon, the citizens walking prescribed loops, the bells refusing to chime, the shadows behaving as polite conspirators. I sat by the window, coin in one hand, hoop in the other, and wondered which object the loop would claim first for itself. If Veron was right, then tonight was not a night at all, merely a margin note between 2 hours that should never have met. I decided I would not sleep, not in this sunlight, not under this hour, because dreams are just another kind of editing here. Instead, I would watch the suns until one of them blinked, and in that blink, perhaps I would find where the archive misplaced the dark. The invitation appeared in my quarters without sound, without courier, without mark of sender, just a folded parchment placed perfectly center on my desk. Its seal was a pressed sunburst with no rays, a blank circle suggesting radiance without proof, its edge warm to the touch despite the room's still air. I broke the seal and read the single sentence inside. Attend. You already know where. No time, no date, no instructions beyond that single command. Outside my window, the citizens moved with their usual precision, But as I looked closer, I saw each wore an identical thin white ribbon on the wrist. It caught the sunlight strangely, absorbing gold rather than reflecting it, as if it stored illumination for some later, unseen purpose. I stepped into the plaza and followed the ribbons, each citizen walking without variation in speed, direction, or expression, their steps soft but impossibly synchronized. They moved toward a street I'd never noticed, though my maps of Euphrosyne were exhaustive. A narrow corridor between two archivist halls now standing wide open. As I entered, the light dimmed, not to darkness, but to a muted, almost reverent glow that seemed to dampen sound rather than obscure sight entirely. The corridor bent downward in a spiral, though there was no indication of descent on my internal map, the air thickening with each slow, deliberate turn. At the base, a single arch opened into a courtyard paved with black glass, reflecting nothing above it except the people standing upon its perfect surface. In the courtyard's center, an empty circle awaited, ringed by silent citizens standing shoulder to shoulder, all wearing those pale white ribbons without the faintest movement. The sunlight above flickered, not like a candle, but like a projection catching dust on its lens, the entire sky momentarily veiled before resuming its stage perfection. Without a signal, the citizens raised their hands and removed the ribbons, each holding them aloft, the fabric now glowing faintly from within like captured strands of dawn. They began to walk the circle's perimeter in unison, steps measured to a beat I could not hear but could feel pulsing through the black glass below. A low vibration entered my bones, not from the ground but from somewhere internal, as if the rhythm had chosen my skeleton as its chosen resonator. I noticed then that no one blinked, not once, as they walked, their eyes wide, irises reflecting the same faint glow as the ribbons they carried above their heads. One by one they dropped the ribbons into the empty circle, the fabric folding neatly on contact with the glass, shrinking slightly as if inhaled by the surface. When the last ribbon fell, a ripple moved outward from the center, distorting the air like heat haze, but the glass remained perfectly cool beneath my boots. Someone began to speak, not loudly, but with a clarity that pressed against the inside of my skull, bypassing ears entirely, arriving as finished meaning in my mind. It was not a prayer to the emperor, nor to any saint, nor to anything resembling divinity, only a list of names, dates, and adjustments. Each name spoken was followed by a pause, during which the citizens nodded in unison, as if acknowledging that some unseen change had been successfully implemented. When my own name came, I felt the temperature drop inside my chest, as though my heart had been replaced by a hollow porcelain vessel. The voice said my name twice, once for the person I remembered being, and once for something else, some version not yet introduced to my mind. In the pause afterward, I knew, without being told, that an edit had been made, and something in me had been smoothed, filed, and reshelved. The citizens lowered their heads then all at once, and the ribbons reappeared on their wrists, tied with impossible precision, the glow gone as if never captured. The black glass at our feet reflected now, not the courtyard above, but a sky that was not Euphrosyne's, a ceiling of deep green clouds moving far too fast. I recognized nothing in that sky, but felt the urge to kneel toward it, my knees locking as though responding to muscle memory I did not own. When I looked up again, the courtyard was empty, the citizens gone, and the spiral corridor behind me stretched upward into pure daylight without any dimming at all. The parchment invitation was no longer in my pocket, but I could still feel the warmth of its seal against the skin of my palm. And though the plaza looked unchanged when I emerged, the chrono in my quarters now displayed a date, 5 months in the future, without explanation or alarm. Every planetary archive I had accessed since arrival contained a cartographic void, a dead coordinate block simply labelled "restricted by holy decree." The size of this gap was unsettling, spanning nearly a quarter of Euphrosyne's habitable surface, yet every map pretended it was simply uncharted wilderness. Official guides referred to it as Omega Sector only in footnotes, without topography, without settlements, without even the abstract outlines of rivers or mountains to suggest substance. When I requested more detail from the Hall of Records, the archivist smiled with professional warmth but turned every page past the relevant entries without hesitation or pause. Each time I attempted to stop her hand, she gently corrected me, saying, "This section is not for you," before moving exactly 3 pages forward. The number 3 repeated too neatly, always 3 pages, always the same pace. Her movements so consistent I suspected they had been rehearsed for centuries without variation. At night I studied my personal map overlays and noticed that Omega's borders never aligned the same way twice, even when pulled from the same data source. One version placed it against the Western Ocean, another buried it deep inland, bordered by farmlands that allegedly supplied 90% of planetary grain. No one I questioned admitted to visiting Omega, but neither did they deny its existence. They simply paused, smiled, and redirected the conversation toward weather or crop yields. It was absence without denial, the kind of gap maintained not by secrecy, but by a mutually agreed refusal to hold the thought long enough to examine it. I decided to walk toward Omega using coordinates triangulated from the most contradictory maps, hoping that overlapping errors would somehow cancel into truth. The first anomaly appeared 15 kilometers from the supposed border, a series of identical road signs, each reading, "Welcome to Euphrosyne's heart," all pointing in different directions. The soil here darkened slightly, as if holding the shadow of something massive above it, though the sky was perfectly clear and fixed in its false serenity. When I passed a small orchard, the air turned noticeably cooler, not with wind, but with the stillness that follows a door closing in a sealed chamber. The trees were spaced with mathematical perfection, yet their fruit bore no stems. Each orange sphere fused directly to the branch as though carved in place. I continued until the ground became unnaturally level, the horizon stretching flat as parchment, my boots producing no echo from the packed earth beneath them. According to my chronometer, I should have crossed into Omega's border within the hour, yet each step simply replicated the same 100 meters of scenery without deviation. Fences appeared, low, rusted and collapsing, yet they curved inward toward me no matter which route I took, their lines bending like drawn wire around a magnet. Eventually, I found a sign half buried in soil, its letters worn but legible enough to read, "You are leaving permitted space. Return before you are rewritten." The word "rewritten" seemed less printed than etched by heat, the edges of the letters still faintly charred, as if fire had shaped them directly into the metal. Beyond the sign lay only a shimmering distortion, not unlike the heat haze I'd seen during the purity rites, but broader, taller, stretching into the false blue sky. Through it, I glimpsed faint structures, towers without bases, roads that bent upward into clouds, shadows cast by objects I could not see entirely. My coin grew cold in my sleeve and the hoop in my satchel began to hum faintly. A vibration felt more in teeth than fingertips. I took a step forward, and the haze solidified into a wall of glassy air, my own reflection staring back, but wearing a white ribbon on its wrist. It lifted its hand to the glass, and I saw its ribbon tighten, constricting until the flesh beneath split into thin, controlled lines of red. The reflection smiled, not the shallow civic smile of Euphrosyne's people, but a stretched, deliberate grin that suggested ownership, not welcome. When I stepped back, the haze softened and the towers vanished, replaced once again by the endless flat plain and mathematically perfect orchard rows. From somewhere far off, yet impossibly close, a voice recited names in the same manner I had heard during the rites, each one followed by a pause. Mine came twice again, but this time the pause afterward seemed to last longer, as if the unseen speaker were considering a more thorough adjustment. I turned away then, not from fear, but from the certainty that entering Omega would not mean crossing into a place, but into a different version of myself entirely. Back in my quarters, the maps had changed. Omega's size was smaller now, confined to a single block near the polar ridge. But in the corner of one parchment, a faint handwritten note had appeared. Coordinates confirmed. Border porous. Subject approaching comprehension. The script was my own handwriting, though I had no memory of writing it, and the ink was still wet to the touch. Outside, the suns had shifted by a fraction, so little that only the trained eye would notice, but their shadows no longer aligned with the city's geometry. I placed the note in my desk drawer, closed it, and immediately heard the faint click of another drawer opening somewhere behind me in the dark. When I turned, the room was empty, but the air smelled faintly of burnt metal, like the edges of the warning sign at Omega's invisible border. I knew then that the sector was not simply scrubbed from maps. It was scrubbed from the people, and now it was trying to write itself into me. The census console greeted me with warmth, but its welcome message felt rehearsed, a voice smiling while counting things it refused to name honestly. Prefect Klein had granted high-clearance access again, which read like permission and tasted like bait, the loop applauding as I reached exactly where it wanted investigating. Population totals displayed first, an elegant integer without fractions, no pending claims, 0 disputes, 0 duplicates, and the kind of perfection that lives inside devotional pamphlets only. I queried by district, age strata, vocational guild, pilgrimage status, and medical exemption, watching graphs align with suspicious symmetry, arcs closing exactly at beautiful integer boundaries. Then I requested raw identities, names, lineages, birth sites, transfer authorizations, and continuity compact signatures, the kind of untidy ledger entries bureaucracies usually bury under ceremonies. Instead of names, the screen returned placeholders: Citizen of Joy, Citizen of Bloom, Citizen of Accord, titles without persons, virtues wearing costumes where faces should actually reside. At first, I suspected redaction filters masking sensitive data until I traced metadata and discovered the truth. The identities were not hidden, they were absent by design. Half the population resolved as categories rather than people. Census entries composed entirely of traits and functions, like hagiographies written about saints nobody ever actually met. Cross-referencing tax rolls, grain rations, and housing allotments changed nothing. The placeholders received stipends, rooms, and fruit, as if virtues were issued rations like obedient workers. I asked the archives attendant for access to pre-compact records, and she smiled apologetically, then scrolled past 3 pages, the ritual correction rehearsed into muscle memory. Early migrations were chaotic, she whispered, eyes unfocusing politely. The census was simplified for harmony, which explains nothing except why questions must dress as blasphemy here. I thanked her, lied about compiling wellness metrics, then retreated to a side alcove where shelves curved like ribs, a paper thorax protecting an undocumented beating heart. Using Veron's coin as a cold anchor, I bypassed the standard interface, cracking open optical ports to pull an indexing spine the loop pretended had never existed. The catalogue wheezed reluctant truth. 93,000 citizens of joy, in Aurelia alone, no births, no deaths, just reconciliation timestamps matching purity right cycles exactly every month. A second class, citizens of accord, appeared whenever disciplinary expenditures peaked, then vanished after rites, their counts redistributed into joy and bloom like pureed memory. I searched for A. Vel, my own entry, and found 2 records: observer, named, and citizen of recognition. The second flagged eligible for reconciliation upon successful adjustment. Adjustment meant editing. Reconciliation meant reshelving. Paradise meant never admitting bodies are heavier than categories, that names weigh more than calibrated smiles carefully rehearsed forever. I printed a fragment, illegal in a friendly way, and the paper emerged warm, fragrant with a floral solvent I recognized from the never-wilting gardens outside sanctified windows. The fragment listed 5 nearby housing cells assigned to placeholders, so I walked there, counting steps against the coin's temperature, a metronome resisting the city's choreographic appetite. Door 1 opened to a room arranged for living, bed creased perfectly, desk arranged meaningfully, fruit bowl replenished, mirror polished, and absolutely no footprints anywhere visible at all. Door 2 held identical furniture, identical arrangement, identical fruit, identical absence. Even the dust motes obeyed geometry, hovering in grids like disciplined choir boys awaiting inspection. Door 3 contained a single pair of shoes, scuffed in convincingly human ways. Though the scuffs repeated, the same arcs mirrored like a stencil's patient deception. I lifted one shoe and found its sole unmarked, no grit, no pebble scars, no wear patterns, a template awaiting the weight of a willing narrative. Door 4 opened into darkness that refused illumination, lumen-stripped beams folding back into themselves, as if light were embarrassed to witness a room registered to nobody. I stepped inside anyway, and the floor remembered a footprint that wasn't mine, shallow depressions warming then cooling, as if a placeholder rehearsed existence minutes earlier. A whisper traveled the skirting board, not sound exactly, more like consent warming timber. Citizen of joy confirms occupancy, a sentence that replaced personhood with compliance entirely. Door 5 was locked, which was adorable in a city without crime, so I knocked and smiled in the polite way bureaucrats use before becoming wolves. The door opened on a woman with perfect posture, perfect ribbon, perfect crescent lips, and perfect eyes fixed on a point 6 inches above mine. "Good afternoon," I said, counting heartbeats to keep my jaw neutral, aware smiles are traps here, baited with harmony, then sprung with administrative absolution ceremonies. "Census verification," I added gently. "Name and household lineage, if you please." And her response arrived like sunshine pressed into a mold, unhurried, unquestioning, and gracelessly precise. "I am citizen of joy," she said, "lineage reconciled, household folded, memory perfected." And the last word felt like varnish, smothering wood grain into fashionable sameness. "Who named you?" I asked, because naming implies agency somewhere, and agency exposes hinges, and hinges expose rooms behind doors that prefer smiling walls instead. "The census named me," she replied, "as it names all who reconcile," then added with a small tilt, "I did not require lineage after forgetting's mercies." "Did you once have another name?" I pressed, letting the coin chill my pulse, bracing for continuity's breeze that always follows whenever identities lean toward unscripted gravity. She blinked once, slowly, perhaps the first unchoreographed blink I had seen in days, then whispered, "My mother said a different word, but we returned it." "Returned to whom?" I asked, and her gaze slid sideways to the wall where shadow should have pooled. Instead, light thickened like syrup resisting the floor. "To the archive," she answered, "because personal names bruise the bloom," a line learned so well it sounded like lullaby threaded through municipal bylaws elegantly. I thanked her and left before the room could congratulate us for agreeing, because praise here is anesthesia, and anesthesia here rewrites without academic footnotes whatsoever. Back at the console, I flagged a random sample of placeholders for spot visitation, then cross-checked market stalls, clinics, transit seats, and ritual squares during bell cycles. Placeholders occupied space impeccably, purchasing apples, receiving checkups, boarding carriages, standing during rites, yet left no trace afterward, no receipts, no charts, no where, no recollection whatsoever. They were use without user, motion without mover, a civic body massaging infrastructure to prove abundance, while denying the scars abundance must normally produce historically. The implication crystallized like frost on warm thought. Half the population is narrative ballast, weight added to stabilize a story inclined to wobble under scrutiny's honest breeze. I compiled these findings into a report titled Identity Deficit, Administrative Concern, then watched the header reformat itself politely into Harmony Metrics, supplemental reassurance instantly. The attachment renamed itself Joy Participation Analysis. The word deficit vanished, and my signature appended with Citizen of Recognition, the placeholder alias I had discovered earlier previously. A calm voice issued from the console's frame, neither male nor female, neither machine nor priest, merely patient. "Names are spikes. We sand spikes to keep children safe." "Children from what?" I asked, hating the tremor in my throat, because anger sounds like adolescence whenever bureaucracies dress as nursery attendants humming at bedtime. "From falling out of the story," it answered, "because the ground beyond the story is cold, sharp, and remembers wrong, which is honest enough to terrify efficiently." I shut the console and breathed until my ribs stopped sounding like index cards flicking under a clerk's thumb, then carried Veron's coin to the plaza for courage. There, the boy named Welcome spun his hoop once, twice, then stopped it with a toe against stone that gleamed like polite, expensive promises whispered gently. "You found their missing names," he said, not a question, eyes bright with something improperly childlike. "Do you want yours to last longer than a ribbon's glow?" "Yes," I said, because pride still blooms even in hostile gardens, and he nodded solemnly like an officiant accepting a vow that will cost knees later. "Then misfile it," he whispered. "Hide your name under someone else's shelf," and pointed toward the archive where Veron's lamp had died like a brave, tired candle. "Place it where joy would never stoop," he added, "among sorrows, accidents, blisters, and scraped knees. A catechism outlawed here, but remembered by feet everywhere." I walked to the memorial gardens, falsely labeled Eternal Bloom Allocation, selected a stone without inscription, and etched quietly. A. Vel stood here unharmonized carefully. The chisel marks shimmered, attempted to heal, then paused, as if the garden considered whether to edit, then distracted, allowed the scar to breathe temporarily. In the reflection of the stone, I saw citizens passing, their ribbons glowing a fraction too brightly, and every second face momentarily blank like unprinted parchment. The blank faces were placeholders between smiles, scaffolding beneath plaster, spreadsheet rows between saints. The garden kept them polite by denying corners where names might catch. I pressed the coin to the stone, felt cold travel into granite like a rumor about rain in a city that forbids weather inconveniently. Behind me, a bell misstruck once, wrong and beautiful, and for a moment the plaza flinched, light quivered, and a dozen placeholders forgot which virtue they were. When equilibrium returned, the scar on the stone remained, small, stubborn, literate, and mine. The coin cooled, the archive's doors sighed, and the censors kept smiling. In my sleeve, the hoop hummed faintly like a paragraph deciding to become a confession, and the console at home waited to rename tonight's report Joy Again. I wrote a single line on my palm in ink that stains slowly. If they erase names, misfile yours until erasing becomes too expensive to perform. When I looked up, Prefect Klein stood across the square, ribbon immaculate, smile adequate, eyes admiring the gardens as if she, too, adored competent punctuation. She inclined her head the slightest degree, approval or warning indeterminate, and the crowd parted around her like footnotes falling obediently beneath a triumphant thesis. Half a population without names means twice the silence when bells ring, I thought, and somewhere beneath marble the soil practiced pronouncing me correctly stubbornly. Tomorrow I would chase the nightmare everyone shares, the Emperor's mouth swallowing language, but tonight I would keep my scar, my coin, and my misfiled self safely. Euphrosyne tallied virtues while pretending people are decimals. I counted scars while pretending hope is arithmetic. Between us, the plaza learned to tolerate one wrong equation. The first time the dream came, I awoke with the taste of gold leaf and candle smoke clinging inside my teeth. It did not arrive as nightmare initially, but as ceremony. Incense floating in perfect spirals, processions gliding without friction, hymns timed to heartbeats exactly. The people in the dream, every single one, wore ribbons brighter than midday, yet their faces shone with identical sunlight stolen from some distant cathedral. They knelt before something vast that hung just beyond the clouds, visible only as a faint distortion, like heat shimmering off polished armor plates. I felt no fear then, only the narcotic certainty of devotion rehearsed for years, though I could not recall practicing any particular liturgy myself consciously. When the clouds parted, the shape revealed itself, not the Emperor's face as depicted in devotional prints, but his mouth alone, impossibly large, impossibly close. It hung in the sky like a wound held open by invisible hooks, lips pale as parchment yet veined with rust-colored cracks widening as it breathed. The voice that came from it was not speech, but the sensation of speech, meaning injected directly into the architecture of thought without linguistic scaffolding whatsoever. Every citizen in the dream pressed their foreheads to the soil in unison, bodies trembling with the same rhythm, like strings plucked by an unseen harpist. And then the voice spoke one word, a word I cannot recall when awake, though my bones hum faintly whenever I think about forgetting it deliberately. By the third night, the dream returned, but now I was standing rather than kneeling, watching the crowd move without the friction of individual volition. The mouth widened, each tooth like a polished shrine, gaps between them dark enough to hold entire star systems swallowed without even a ceremonial pause. I noticed the boy named Welcome among them, his hoop clasped to his chest, eyes fixed upward, smile trembling against some private resistance unspoken. When the voice entered us, I tried to shield my mind with the image of Varen's coin, its cold weight an anchor in thought's warm tide. It worked only briefly. The gold taste flooded in again, and behind it, the conviction that my name had been given willingly to something higher. I awoke gasping, the scent of incense still clinging to my sleeves, though I had not attended any rite or even left my quarters. Prefect Klein summoned me that morning, her tone casual, as if discussing flower allocations, yet her eyes scanned me for cracks like a potter checking glaze. "You dreamt, didn't you?" she asked, and my silence betrayed me, because in Euphrosyne, silence is an answer that needs no punctuation to be complete. "They all do eventually," she continued. "Paradise teaches itself in sleep. The Emperor's mouth speaks without argument, without confusion, without the burden of recorded minutes." "Why only his mouth?" I asked, before considering the risk, and her smile deepened as though I'd requested a particularly delightful flavor of poison. "Because the eyes might remember you," she said, "and remembrance is a privilege for saints, not for those who still bruise." That night I refused to sleep, pacing the archive halls until my feet mapped them into muscle memory, reading spines of books that were all too recent. But even without sleep, the dream came. I was simply standing in the same hall, and the ceiling peeled away to reveal the mouth above. This time the lips moved in slow, deliberate patterns, the motion less like speech and more like chewing, each syllable grinding against the enamel of reality. I tried to walk away, but the floor stretched with each step, keeping me beneath it, my breath sinking unwillingly to its slow inhale and exhale. Around me, citizens emerged from the book aisles, their ribbons glowing white-hot. Eyes rolled upward until only the whites caught the mouth's invisible light. The word came again, louder this time, pressing itself into my teeth until I felt they would crack, leaving my gums filled with liquid devotion. I awoke with blood on my pillow, not much, but enough to stain the ribbon Prefect Klein had given me during the welcoming ceremony. I hid the ribbon under the floorboard where Varen's lamp once sat, though I suspect the loop already wrote its location into some invisible inventory. The following day, I overheard two market vendors, placeholders by the look of their too-perfect posture, repeating the dream to each other like a recipe. No fear, no hesitation, just the facts, the gold taste, the kneeling, the mouth, the word they couldn't remember yet knew was correct. Every third sentence they would pause, tilt their heads upward briefly, then resume speaking, as if checking whether the mouth had added or removed details. The rest of the city carried on, but I began to notice subtle sways in the crowd during pauses, movements timed to some distant breath. Even the banners above the plaza moved in sync, not with wind, there was none, but with an unseen exhalation from somewhere higher. I began marking the dream's occurrences on a scrap of parchment. The intervals shortened, 3 days, then 1, then twice in a single waking span. On the 7th occurrence, the mouth did not speak at all, it simply opened wider, and inside I saw not darkness but rows of smaller mouths. They were arranged like seeds in a fruit, each whispering silently, each facing outward towards some other sky beyond my comprehension. When I woke, the gold taste was stronger, almost metallic, and the mirror in my quarters showed a faint gold sheen to my own teeth. Klein's message arrived before midday. Attendance at the next purity rite is mandatory for those blessed with the Emperor's direct word. I burned the parchment log, but the ash lingered in the air longer than natural, curling toward the ceiling like it too wanted to be swallowed. The mouth followed me even in reflections after that, in market windows, in puddles, in the polished lenses of the sensor's console. It never moved in these visions, just hung there, lips parted slightly, as if considering whether to speak or simply watch. Somewhere in the city, bells rang in triple measure, a pattern I had never heard before, and the citizens all paused to listen. When the bells stopped, every head turned skyward in perfect unison, and for a fraction of a second, their smiles trembled. I suspect that's the only moment they remember they are allowed to be afraid, and then the mouth speaks again. I first saw him in the orchard's spiral, hoop tucked against his ribs, smile steady as a metronome, eyes reflecting Euphrosyne's counterfeit sunlight without blinking once. Later, I saw him again near the Hall of Records, the same height, the same sandals, the same tiny scuff on the same right strap. By evening, he stood beside the memorial gardens that pretend not to be graves, hoop balanced on a fingertip, watching reflections arise where shadows should breathe. A day passed, then 5 months disappeared by the calendar's edit, and he was unchanged, still the size of a child who could count clouds joyfully. I measured him with my gaze, clavicle to crown, shoulder to wrist, wrist to hoop. The ratios persisted exactly, not even growth's small rebellions dared appear. Placeholders came and went with ribbon smiles, but he lingered like punctuation that refuses removal, a comma insisting the sentence will not end mercifully yet. When I approached, the hoop rotated once by itself, then stilled perfectly, and he lifted his face toward me with politeness that felt older than marble foundations. "Welcome," he said, and the word contained no article, as if I were not a visitor, but a function the plaza kept in comfortable storage. "You know my name," I answered, and he nodded without vanity, the way archivists nod when a card finally accepts its drawer after weeks of subtle misfiling. "What are you called?" I asked, bracing for ribbon titles, and he whispered, almost apologetically, "I am named the same everywhere, so nobody fights about favorites." He did not elaborate, and the space between us filled with birdsong that imitated children laughing, a slick sound designed to keep adults from asking expensive questions. I knelt because adults should kneel sometimes when speaking with beings who might be children, or might be alarms disguised as playful gifts to obedience. "Do you live with someone?" I asked, and he lifted the hoop again, balancing it on a raised toe, an answer performing choreography rather than composing sentences. "Everyone lives with me," he said, "when they are being good," and the word good clicked like a latch, a gentle lock that expected praise for its manners. I reached for my auspex and angled the lens, pretending to admire the hoop's workmanship while sweeping for biosignature anomalies that accompany certain Mechanicus preservation heresies. Results came back wrong, not because of noise, but because of clarity. His vitals were present, constant, flawless, showing metabolic stillness without cellular death or entropy accumulation. He was alive in the way a prayer is alive, recited, maintained, polished by repetition until the mouth forgets hunger and the tongue forgets protest entirely. "Has anyone told you stories about before?" I asked, testing continuity by folklore, and he considered, then shook his head with kindness that forgave my clumsy intrusion. "There is only after," he said, "after the smile learned to hold us steady," and my jaw clenched, because verbs can lie even more politely than smiles here. I tried another angle, the predator's question hidden inside auntly concern. "Do you remember your first hoop?" And he answered, "It has always been this shape, exactly." I followed him that afternoon as he walked across districts without fatigue, appearing at corners sooner than footsteps allow, moving along seams where maps disagree loudly. In the market, stallholders greeted him with the mechanical Cassia-sweet tone reserved for auditors, and he replied with a bow equal parts childlike and imperial. At the clinic, a Medicaid servitor paused mid-injection to nod, the needle hovering against a placeholder's skin that did not indent because placeholders pretend friction. By dusk not dusk, he perched on the archive steps, watching doors breathe as if ashamed, And I realized he always placed himself where the loop tightens visibly, where times splice, where smiles crack, where bells misstrike. There he stands already, the loop's smallest lighthouse, announcing dangerous shoals with a beam of obedient innocence. When I sat beside him, he offered the hoop like a confession, and its weight startled me. It felt denser than steel, yet rang like sanctified glass. "Spin it," he said, and I did, and the air trembled slightly, a shimmer forming inside the circle, revealing a street I had not yet visited. Within that circle, the citizens wore older clothes, less immaculate, teeth less uniform, fruit less glossy, and a wind moved without permission, making laundry riot joyfully. I reached toward the vision, but the hoop slowed, and the world inside blurred, then hardened back into Euphrosyne's curated plaza with its obedient pigeons. He caught the hoop neatly, palms unchafed, expression thoughtful, as if measuring how much rope to grant a chronicler before duty tightens into noose. "Why don't you age?" I asked finally, because courtesy is a veil, and I own only so many veils before weather ruins them irreparably anyway. "I age when stories end," he said simply, "and paradise forbids endings," then added, quieter, "You are trying to misfile yourself. That is brave and expensive." He looked toward the memorial garden's false stones, where I had carved a Vel stood here unharmonized, and for a breath the scar brightened like fresh rain. "You read it," I said, and he nodded, palm pressing the hoop's rim until metal remembered heat. The reflection inside flickered again, then settled obediently reluctant. "I see what keeps," he said, "so I can tell them where to sand," and I swallowed, understanding that his purpose was cataloguer and eraser both simultaneously. "How many times have we spoken?" I asked, and he answered after a pause. "Enough that you predicted this question perfectly today and still hoped I would miscount kindly." I felt Veron's coin cool against my skin, the ribbon dampen subtly, and a municipal breeze carried the orchard's sugar smell like an apology wearing perfume. "Help me then," I said, because pride is costly and time shorter than choreographed sunlight pretends. "Show me where the loop edits hardest and where it breathes least." He considered again, then lifted the hoop and framed my face inside its circle, and the plaza outside receded, replaced by shelves and chalk and whispers. We stood inside the archive's forbidden stacks without walking, and his voice, softer here, guided me to a narrow gap where ledgers slid when nobody watches carefully. "Names are filed here until they soften," he said, pointing to a row labeled Recollection Compliance, the spines warm, bindings too flexible, letters smudged into obliging elegance. "Yours keeps resisting," he added. "It scratches shelves," and he looked almost proud, the way librarians love unruly patrons who nevertheless return books precisely. He placed the hoop against a ledger, and for a breath, I saw dozens of versions of myself, each smiling more earnestly, each report shorter, shinier, kinder. With a small shake, he dispelled them, the circle empty again, and the stack smelled like thunderstorms in rooms without windows, a pitying perfume for stubborn readers. "If you vanish," I asked, "what should I do?" And he answered, "Remember the wrong street, the one the hoop showed. Walk there during bells, not between them." "Prefect Klein will notice," I said, and he nodded with the acceptance of tides, adding, "She already notices, but she admires proper citations, even treason cited beautifully." We stepped back into the plaza without transition. A page had simply turned, and the city reset its posture, pleased to find its smile still symmetrical again. He pressed the hoop to my chest once, a ceremonial tap, and I felt the wordless assurance of ritual. A blessing, a dare, and a receipt simultaneously. "Why help me?" I asked, and his answer landed so softly it barely wrinkled air. "Because once when I aged, you remembered, and that misfile still hurts them." Then he walked away, identical steps aligning with the stone's geometry, hoop tucked against his ribs, smile steady as metronome, eyes full of borrowed, tireless sunlight. Only after he vanished did I realize the plaza clock had skipped a minute forward, the first honest change of time since sunlight learned midnight's manners. And somewhere behind the archive doors, I heard a ledger fall, not loudly, but but with the relieved thud of a book that refused being sanded any smoother. I touched my scarred stone, the coin cooled, the ribbon remembered rain, and the world's smallest lighthouse left me a horizon where endings might someday breathe carefully. When bells chimed, I counted deliberately wrong, held my breath one beat longer than harmony requested, and the square shivered, displeased, then steadied like etiquette swallowing anger. Tonight I would write a report that refuses brochure grammar, and I would file it in the wrong drawer under weather, beside storms allowed only privately. If the child is their checksum, then I will be their arithmetic error. If the hoop is their window, I will be their brick. The mouth awaits above with patient teeth. The soil rehearses below with patient hunger, and between them my name scratches shelves until librarians finally bleed admission. I slept later with my jaw unclenched, which is rebellion here, and dreamed a single dream of the boy's face older, tired, and mercifully imperfectly smiling. The Vault of Joy was not listed on any public map, only whispered as an amenity during continuity orientation, a place for regulated ecstasies and civic recalibration. Prefect Klein mentioned it as one mentions weather, neutral, inevitable, harmless, then added that citizens emerging from its doors exhibited improved compliance and longer-lasting smiles subsequently. I requested a tour as chronicler, receiving immediate approval, which always alarms me here, because permissions arrive like elevators already waiting at the correct floor. The entrance lay beneath the forum, behind curtains embroidered with stylized suns lacking faces, their rays stitched so tightly the fabric hummed when touched lightly. A steward awaited me, wearing the white ribbon and a second band of grey, signifying therapeutic authority. His smile was careful, the curve measured against obligations. Sessions are individualized, he said, palm hovering over a console that glowed pleasantly. The vault learns your narratives, clarifies confusions, and restores joy to tired architecture. What does it take in exchange? I asked, and his eyes flicked to the curtain seam, where light thickened, then to my wrist where Veren's ribbon hid. Only the echoes that bruise, he answered, so memory can carry itself without unnecessary weight, which sounded like pruning spoken gently over a child's hopeful sapling. He guided me down a ramp whose slope never steepened yet somehow cost breath, the air cooling as if entering a cellar where wine dreams of permanence. Doors bloomed along the corridor like pale petals, each marked with a virtue rather than number, accord, thanksgiving, gentleness, recollection, the last remaining ajar as if breathing expectantly. I glanced inside and saw people reclined upon contoured couches, eyes open, faces slack with pleasure, too tidy to be lust, too rehearsed to be wonder. Their hands twitched occasionally but never clenched, their mouths parted but never drooled, their ribs rose in patient cadence like metronomes blessed by municipal chaplains thoughtfully. No restraints bound them, no tubes fed them, yet none stood up, none shifted, none glanced at doors. Pleasure here had erased verbs requiring knees completely. The steward offered me a couch. I counter-offered a request to observe the engine. He hesitated, then smiled, as if my impertinence completed a necessary permission ritual. We crossed into a control room built from tempered glass and softened brass, its consoles emitting harmonics that warmed the skin and relaxed unconfessed clenched teeth. Charts displayed citizens as amethyst waves, peaks trimmed where sorrow spiked, troughs filled where anxiety hollowed, everything smoothing toward ideal plateau, joy without topography or weather ever. Where does it come from? I asked, watching amplitude flatten into brochure perfection, and he replied, from continuity. It remembers how we like to feel and complies. Continuity is not a reservoir, I said, because bureaucracy rarely carries liquids. It is an index, and he nodded patiently. Indexes store references, and references store enough. He opened a panel revealing a wafered lattice of shimmering filaments. They pulsed with faint color shifts synchronized to breaths in the neighboring room perfectly. Signal enters here. Interface diffuses through skin, he said. No needles, no sacrament, just consent. That is our distinction. And the word consent tasted curiously medicinal today. I asked about duration. He recited a policy. I asked about outliers. He recited a prayer. I asked about those who never left. He looked almost grateful. Some sessions clarify so completely that departure is optional, he said. Their civic contributions continue as radiant examples. The city learns from their stability continuously. Examples behind closed doors, I muttered. And he neither agreed nor disagreed, only adjusted a dial labeled kindness gain, which felt like flattery wearing a cuff politely. In the observation room, a woman on a couch whispered as her wave flattened, thanking someone named Father who could not possibly have walked these perfect corridors. Another patient smiled broadly and exhaled, repeating, "No graveyards, no dust, no endings," while a third emitted quiet laughter that looped seamlessly, a brook engineered for pleasure. I pressed my palm to the glass and felt it vibrating like a purring animal. The coin in my sleeve cooled, offended, the ribbon dampened deliberately. "May I try a minimal dose?" I asked, calculating risk as information. He considered, then produced a smaller couch resembling a confession bench engineered by florists thoughtfully. I lay down, keeping the coin against skin, ribbon wound over knuckles. The filaments above brightened and the air thickened, as if syrup remembered rain softly. "Consent?" he asked, and I answered, "Conditional," then added, "Record everything. Because sometimes bureaucracy is a shield if you make it write its hunger publicly." Warmth unfolded through my scalp, traveled beneath the skin with the intimacy of familiar fingertips, then down the spine, then outward, mapping me like a cartographer. Joy did not arrive like lightning. It seeped like blessed honey, dissolving friction between joints, sanding grief's edges until my bones agreed to be furniture. Memories surfaced selectively. My mother's hands slicing pears, a priest's cloak crackling in winter air, Veron's lamp glowing stubbornly, each presented without splinters, polished for display. When pain tried to claw upward, a frozen trench night on Hive-Shrike, a friend's last joke before shelling, the vault rotated the memory gently until beauty faced forward. I realized with simultaneous awe and rage that it did not delete. It curated, converting jagged narrative into gallery pieces, installing placards, reading reconciled beneath frames tastefully. "Increase?" the steward asked softly, and I nearly nodded because the bliss promised competence without cost, poetry without regret, duty without the ache of uncorrected history. Then the coin went frigid enough to bite, the ribbon's fibers constricted like winter twine, and a thought rang clear. Curated joy is anesthesia, not absolution truly. "Decrease," I said, voice thick with velvet, "then show me those who never leave." And his hesitation wrote a confession across the console brighter than any lumen. He led me down another hall, this one quieter, the harmonics deeper, as if the building itself slept and dreamed of tidy, archivally safe mornings forever. Behind glass, 4 figures reclined beneath flowering arches. Their ribbons had grown into their wrists, pale threads emerging as roots, petals feeding on their pulses gently. Their faces wore ecstasies beyond sex, beyond prayer, beyond victory. Their bodies were perfectly hydrated, perfectly nourished, perfectly still. The charts above read, "Civic contribution, exemplary, precisely." "How long?" I asked, voice returning to itself slowly, and he answered, "Years for some, decades for others. Time here belongs to continuity's discretion entirely." "Do they speak?" I pressed, and he nodded, toggling a switch. Soft voices filled the corridor, each repeating a single sentence shaped for brochure margins exactly. "Everything is already all right," said one. "It never hurts again," said another. "There will be no funerals," murmured a third. The fourth whispered, "I am finally finished." Finished meant ended, ended meant forbidden, forbidden meant safest. I closed my eyes and saw the Emperor's mouth closing gently, like a curtain that refuses encores politely. "Release is possible," the steward added quickly, hearing my breath sharpen, "when they ask." And the last clause hung fragile, because mouths that never move cannot ask anything. "What does the vault ask in return?" I said, and he finally answered without embroidery, "Your capacity to find fault with joy that keeps the city from cracking." "Then it is not joy," I replied. It is spackle, and he winced, because metaphors are knives that slip past policies and cut wrists free elegantly sometimes. We returned to the control room. He offered water. I declined. He offered gratitude. I declined again. He offered confidentiality. I accepted, because predators prefer quiet hunting always. At the threshold curtain, he paused and said, almost pleading, "We built this to keep people from breaking." And I answered, "You built it to keep records agreeable." Outside, the forum's air felt thinner, as if I'd climbed a mountain during the tour. The sun seemed closer and shadows shorter and bells gentler. In my quarters, the mirror tried to smile for me. I let it, then wrote on the glass with breath, "I prefer splinters properly." The letters fogged, trembled, and vanished too quickly. The hoop hummed from the satchel. The coin cooled again. The ribbon remembered rain defiantly. My jaw unlearned choreography bravely. I filed my report in the wrong drawer under weathering, knowing the archive would attempt relocation, then etched a second line into my scarred memorial stone discreetly. If joy requires forgetting, it is not mercy. If forgetting requires vaults, it is not faith. Somewhere beneath the forum, a chart flattened beautifully. Somewhere above the plaza, the mouth considered my sentence. Somewhere between, a child's hoop paused politely, then spun stubbornly. I slept a little, badly, and dreamed those 4 exemplary citizens finally turned their heads toward the door, mouths closing, faces aging, smiles cracking, palms opening. When I woke, the air tasted less like honey and more like iron. My teeth ached with remembered names, and the vault's harmonics failed to... Tomorrow I would descend to the tunnels rumored beneath the gardens where flesh hums. Tonight I would keep my splinters sharp enough to write without anesthesia permanently. The first time I noticed them, the sky was so clear that the clouds seemed arranged for portraits of approval, the kind of clarity propaganda loves, blue without gradient, light without heat, an expanse that dares you to believe nothing hides anywhere. It happened during a civic assembly in the plaza, where citizens recited the oath of harmony in perfect rhythm, breaths synchronized unnervingly. Midway through the chant, my gaze wandered upward, and I saw contours in the clouds that were too deliberate to be coincidence. Not shapes like animals or faces born from idle imagination, but structures, edges, symmetry, forms suggesting intent, architecture too large to exist in our airspace. At first I told myself it was weather manipulation, a blessing from continuity, atmospheric sculpting to remind us the city cares constantly for us. Then one of the forms moved, not like drifting vapor, but like an eyelid drawing open, its arc too smooth to be wind's accident. Beneath the white shroud, I saw the faint glimmer of something reflective, wet perhaps, catching the sun the way pupils catch firelight. The smile of the man beside me did not falter. His eyes followed my line of sight, but seemed to register nothing at all. Either he truly saw nothing, or he had been taught long ago that seeing is not the same as noticing deliberately. I stood there frozen, trying to measure distance, but the proportions refused to obey perspective, as if size changed depending on whether you believed it. The shapes shifted again, multiple now, their movement coordinated, like lenses narrowing, adjusting focus, centering not on the plaza but directly upon me, carefully. A chill gripped my spine, though the air remained warm. It felt like standing on a parade ground, while artillery zeroes in invisibly overhead. The oath ended, applause began, but the sound dulled as if cotton had been stuffed into my ears without physical intrusion. Above, the clouds darkened subtly around those shapes, not with storm threat, but with density, as though the sky thickened to support their weight quietly. I pretended to cough, stepping away from the assembly, drifting toward a shaded colonnade where the view upward remained unobstructed, yet less conspicuous than open plaza scrutiny. From there, I could see more clearly. The clouds were not drifting at all, only the gaps between them shifted like rearranged curtains. The eyes, there were 3 I could count, blinked asynchronously, each movement slow enough to feel intentional, like a predator saving energy, because the prey cannot flee. I remembered the archivist's warning about loops, how observation here worked both ways, and realized these were not symbols. They were apertures for something watching. I could not tell if the watchers were in orbit in the atmosphere, or somewhere entirely else, peering in through a fabricated sky screen effortlessly. Later, in my quarters, I tried to sketch them from memory, but the proportions collapsed into nonsense whenever I set pen to page stubbornly. Lines curved into spirals, angles inverted, and the paper warped slightly under my touch as though resisting the record, preferring it remain unwritten. I placed the drawing in my satchel anyway, beside the ribbon, coin, and hoop, knowing the city would attempt to misfile it within hours deliberately. When the knock came at my door that evening, I expected the steward from the vault, but instead found a young courier smiling politely outside. He delivered a parcel wrapped in blue silk, unmarked except for a single embroidered eye stitched in thread that shimmered faintly under lamplight. Inside lay a mirror no larger than my palm, its surface slightly concave, edges worn smooth like a river stone held for decades lovingly. When I looked into it, I did not see my reflection. I saw sky, cloudless, blindingly blue, and a single massive dark iris dilating. The view trembled slightly, as though the mirror itself was breathing, and a faint humming filled the room, the same tone I'd heard beneath gardens earlier. I dropped the mirror onto the desk. The eye blinked, slow and deliberate, before the surface clouded to ordinary silver and reflected my face reluctantly. The courier had vanished, leaving no footprints in the hall, and my neighbors smiled as they passed, their glances never lingering more than etiquette allowed conveniently. That night, I kept my curtains drawn, but sleep refused me. Whenever I closed my eyes, I saw the watchers adjusting their focus slowly. Dream and waking bled together until I could no longer tell if my breathing was my own, or timed to something overhead invisibly. At some point, I rose and parted the curtains slightly. The sky was clear again, but the clarity now felt staged, an empty stage deliberately. Stars dotted the expanse, but some did not twinkle. They pulsed, like distant machinery, like warning beacons that were not meant for my species entirely. One of them moved against the pattern of the constellations, its path deliberate, until it aligned perfectly with my vantage and seemed to pause patiently. I whispered a curse, a prayer, an unformed thought all at once, and the pulsing quickened as though it had been waiting for that signal exactly. In the stillness, I understood something without evidence. Those shapes in the clouds were not arrivals. They had always been here, hidden above the perfection. They were as much a part of Euphrosyne as the gardens, the rituals, the smiles, and they watched not for rebellion, but for deviation from contentment. Because contentment here was not a byproduct, it was the harvest, and the watchers were simply ensuring the crop remained ripe enough to consume fully. When dawn came, the clouds were back, white and perfect, but their shadows fell in patterns that could only belong to something far larger than weather. It began in the plaza of glass, where every building's facade doubles as a mirror to project the illusion of infinite harmony continuously. You can't walk 3 paces in Euphrosyne without catching your reflection in polished stone, burnished steel, or the surface of still ornamental water pools. We were taught this was for beauty, for morale, citizens seeing themselves as part of the whole, woven into Paradise's self-sustaining image, effortlessly and without question. The first irregularity came when I passed the east-facing facade of the Ministry of Plenty and saw my reflection linger a heartbeat after I stopped moving. At first, I thought it was the after-image of sunlight in my vision, but then it blinked, and my own eyelids had not moved synchronously. It was subtle, easily dismissed, yet something about the delay prickled my spine, like cold rain dripping under a collar in the absence of clouds. I kept walking, testing others, stepping before shop windows, slowing at public fountains, and each time the reflections obeyed, until they didn't, always in tiny hairline deviations. A woman at the baker's stall dropped her loaf. Her reflection caught it before she did, hands moving just slightly faster than reality permitted naturally. The boy with the hoop appeared again near the archive steps, rolling it toward a mirrored column. His reflection simply stood still, watching me intently. By midday, I was seeing it everywhere. The subtle breaks, the near misses between motion and mirror, as though both sides were rehearsing but not in perfect time. Prefect Klein called it a lapse in mirror protocol, a term spoken like an official category, but delivered with too much precision to be casual. She insisted it happened only during atmospheric recalibrations, nothing to worry about, yet her fingers drummed on her desk as though tapping out a warning code. I asked her who calibrated the atmosphere. She smiled, tilting her head slightly, and said, "It's not important who, only that it remains calibrated always." That night, I avoided my own mirror entirely, dressing and eating in darkness, listening to the hum in the walls grow steadily louder by each hour. At some point, the hum shifted to a faint, irregular tapping, like fingernails against glass, coming from the direction of the bathroom door deliberately closed earlier. I dared not open it, but in the corner of my eye I saw the faint glimmer of silver under the threshold, like moonlight trapped there. The tapping stopped. Then a voice, identical to mine but whispering from behind the door, said a single sentence. "We are already where they want." I stepped back, my heel striking the bed frame, and the mirror's silver glow dimmed instantly, leaving the bathroom swallowed in its ordinary, perfect darkness again. When I finally looked in the wash basin's small mirror at dawn, my reflection was smiling just slightly wider than I was without my permission. The expression faded only when I blinked twice in quick succession, the way I'd seen Klein blink during our first meeting in her office. From then on, reflections began to anticipate rather than mimic. My hand would twitch, and the mirror hand would already be halfway into the next motion, unnervingly. In public, I noticed some citizens holding their gaze at mirrored surfaces for too long, eyes unblinking, as if in silent conversation with the other side. Others avoided mirrors altogether, crossing the street to escape a storefront, their smiles fixed, but their bodies stiff like prey scenting a predator close. I tried testing the anomaly with the sensor's console's reflective frame, writing a word backwards so my reflection could read it as forwards automatically. The reflection tilted its head, squinted, then smiled, not at me, but at something behind me that wasn't there when I turned around to check carefully. I didn't use that console again. Later that day, the census steward visited, delivering forms that were already filled in with answers I hadn't given personally. In the central market, I caught sight of Veron in the reflection of a fruit vendor's scales, though he had vanished from records weeks ago entirely. The reflected Veron was thinner, his ribbon frayed, his lips moving without sound, but when I mouthed his name, his eyes widened in sudden, urgent recognition. He pressed his palm to the inside of the reflective surface, leaving an imprint that didn't fade even when a breeze rattled the stall's awning overhead. When I touched the same spot, the surface was cold enough to hurt, and for a moment I thought I felt fingers pressing back against mine. By evening, every reflective surface in my quarters seemed subtly warped, not bent physically, but showing angles of the room that didn't exist in real space. A mirror on the wardrobe displayed a door that wasn't in my apartment, and beyond that door, a light that pulsed in triple rhythm distinctly. I covered the mirrors with cloth, but in the still water of my drinking glass, I could still see my reflection looking back too intently. It mouthed words I couldn't hear, though I recognized one repeated shape, the gold word from the Emperor's mouth dream that I could never recall awake. The glass shattered in my hand without me squeezing, as if the reflection had leaned forward and struck it from the other side deliberately. That night, I dreamed of the Plaza of Glass again, but I was inside the reflection, watching my waking self walk away without noticing me present. Every other reflection, every citizen, was staring directly at me from their side, smiling the same impossible, wide, patient smile that never touched their own waking eyes. When I woke, my window was ajar, though I had locked it, and the wardrobe mirror was uncovered despite the cloth still neatly pinned in place. My reflection blinked once, twice, exactly in my rhythm. Then it stopped blinking entirely, smiling, waiting for me to be the one to break the timing first. I realized then that the protocol had not failed, it had been completed, and we were the ones now lagging behind what they'd become already. The entrance wasn't on any map, not even the ones I stole from the archivist's restricted cabinets in the Hall of Civic Memory. It was a drainage culvert on the western fringe, where manicured lawns bled into marshland, and the air smelled faintly of iron and rain. The grate was locked, but not with a padlock. Its bars were fused together, as if melted and reformed by heat, not from any forge. I had to use the null iron knife I'd hidden since Sector Omega to pry through, sparks whispering like insects as the metal came apart reluctantly. Inside, the tunnel sloped downward in a way that felt steeper than possible, as though gravity itself was tilting to encourage my descent further. The air grew warmer with each step, humid in a way that carried not water but the faint tang of breath and skin constantly. The hum started faint, just below hearing, a vibration in the bones, but the deeper I went, the more it resolved into something almost musical entirely. It was not music with notes or rhythm. It was resonance, shifting like a throat clearing, punctuated by occasional tremors that felt like giant lungs exhaling. The walls changed too, stone and metal giving way to something pale, fibrous, textured like scar tissue stretched too thin over something living underneath persistently. My hand brushed it by accident. It was warm, and beneath the surface something shifted, almost flinching from my touch before settling again carefully. The hum became louder, layered, as though dozens, hundreds of voices were buried in the sound, not singing words but sustaining a single, unending tone together. As the passage opened into a cavern, I saw them. The walls were not walls at all, but torsos, shoulders, necks, heads, all fused seamlessly together. Eyes closed, mouths open, each face slack with the blissful expression I'd come to associate with Euphrosyne's contented citizens above ground in daylight. Their throats vibrated in perfect unison, each breath timed as if conducted, feeding the air with a sound so constant it began to feel solid physically. Where the floor met the walls, pale limbs protruded at odd angles, twitching occasionally as though they still retained some fragment of independent will separately. I wanted to believe they were dead, but the occasional slow blink or shift of a jaw made the lie impossible to cling to safely. In the center of the cavern, suspended from strands of sinew that pulsed faintly, was something that might once have been a civic governor proudly. Its body was elongated, skin stretched like parchment over bone, but the face, smiling, was untouched, pristine, as though carved fresh from memory and preserved eternally. Its mouth moved, but no sound emerged. Instead, the hum deepened, vibrating my teeth, making my eyes water as pressure built in my skull relentlessly. I realized with a jolt that the hum was not merely sound, it was shaping thought, directing the rhythm of my breathing, slowing my heartbeat deliberately. The figure's hand rose in a slow arc, fingers curling in a beckoning motion, though I was far enough away that it couldn't truly reach physically. Still, I felt the pull, an almost magnetic tug, not on my body, but on the part of me that remembers why I came here at all. The walls responded to its gesture, faces shifted subtly, mouths widening, tones bending upward in a harmony so dissonant it scraped the edge of nausea. In the shifting gaps between faces, I saw glimmers of something wet and metallic. Pipes, conduits, machinery grafted into flesh as though both had grown together seamlessly. These were not prisoners. They were infrastructure, a living engine that powered something above, their joy harnessed as raw material for the illusion of paradise forever. One pair of eyes snapped open suddenly, locking with mine. The mouth attached to them formed my name perfectly without moving the rest of the face. I stumbled back, hitting the wall opposite, only to feel more torsos there, more faces pressing gently against me, skin warm and pulse steady beneath it. Their hum rose another note, and in the echo I thought I heard words, ancient, alien, threading through, promising not freedom but release into sameness eternally. My knees weakened as the air thickened with the resonance. Part of me wanted to kneel, to let the sound strip away my singular self entirely. I forced the null iron knife into the wall, the metal hissing against living tissue, and the hum cracked, voices stuttering in sudden collective surprise painfully. A fissure opened in the far wall, spilling light that wasn't light, more like liquid gold that hurt to look at directly for too long. The governor thing twisted toward it slowly, mouth closing for the first time, eyes snapping open to reveal irises like mirrors reflecting nothing recognizable anywhere. The fissure began sealing on its own, tissue knitting rapidly, and I realized if it closed fully, I'd be trapped here inside their choir forever. I dove through, landing hard in another tunnel, the hum muffled but still pressing faintly at the edges of thought like a phantom limb remaining. Behind me, the wall sealed entirely. I could still hear the faint resonance, a single note now, steady as a heartbeat I could never ignore. As I limped upward toward what I prayed was the surface, I knew the truth. The paradise's perfection was fed, always fed, by something beneath alive. The smiling faces above were just another layer of the machine. The real work was done in the dark, where joy was distilled from flesh constantly, and I could still feel their eyes, closed though they had been, tracking me through the walls, humming, patient, knowing I would hear them again inevitably one day. The Hall of Records sat at the very heart of Euphrosyne, a cathedral-shaped monolith whose marble walls shimmered faintly under the eternal midday sun. From the outside it looked as old as the Imperium itself, every column carved with reliefs of saints whose names I recognized from catechism lessons. But the moment I stepped through the threshold, the air shifted, cooler, heavier, thick with the smell of parchment and a faint electrical tang beneath it. Rows upon rows of archivist servitors hunched at massive desks, their quills scratching ceaselessly, faces expressionless, eyes rolled upward in trance, as they worked without pause or error. Each wore a gilded mask, shaped into a smile, the metal so finely wrought, it seemed fused to the skin beneath entirely without seam. The High Archivist, a towering figure in robes that seemed woven from printed scripture itself, greeted me with a voice like paper, tearing slowly in silence. "You seek the saints," he said, not as a question, but as if reading the conclusion of a book I had not yet opened. I asked for the original histories of Euphrosyne, pre-colonial records, terraforming logs, anything that might reveal how this world had achieved such impossible perfection permanently. He led me to a chamber deep in the hall, its walls lined with illuminated manuscripts, each bound in what looked disturbingly like cured human skin. When he pulled one from the shelf, the parchment was blank, until I blinked, and lines of ink bloomed across it like veins spreading outward. The words were immaculate, high Gothic, recording the miraculous arrival of saints who had purged the world of imperfection in his name. Names I'd never heard before were listed alongside canonized heroes, their deeds described in detail, too specific to have been invented casually or without purpose. Yet, when I turned a page back, the text was different, same saint, same date, but the miracle had changed into something entirely unrelated and contradictory. I flipped back and forth, watching the ink rewrite itself in real time, entire lifetimes shifting in and out of existence without a single smudge remaining. The High Archivist didn't seem alarmed. He simply watched me with patient amusement, like a teacher indulging a child's discovery of an obvious, ancient trick. "History," he murmured, "is a living thing here. It serves the need of the moment. The saints are born when they are required most." I demanded to know who decided the need, who gave permission to overwrite reality's ledger. His smile deepened, eyes glinting beneath the hood of scripture cloth. "Permission is not sought. The need is the will of the world, and the world remembers only what sustains its joy most completely." I noticed then that the saints in the illuminated borders of the page were shifting, their faces morphing, robes changing color, weapons dissolving into new forms suddenly. One figure's face stabilized for a heartbeat, and I froze. It was mine, staring back at me from the halo of a canonized martyr patiently. The ink bled into more words, recounting acts I had never performed, sermons I had never given, victories over heresy I had never seen or imagined. The High Archivist gently closed the book, returning it to the shelf. Immediately, the volumes to either side shifted subtly to accommodate its new weight. I realized none of the books here had spines labeled, because their titles changed constantly, identities mutable, even the bindings subtly altering hue as I watched them. In the center of the chamber stood a pulpit. On it, a scroll unfurled, writing itself in strokes too quick for the eye to follow entirely. Approaching, I caught phrases, "The joy remains unbroken." "The saint's blood turns to light." "Memory is the last impurity, and it is gone." I tore my gaze away, but the words had burned into my sight, lingering ghost-like no matter how tightly I shut my eyes or blinked rapidly. The archivist placed a hand on my shoulder. It was cold, and under the robe, I felt the shape of mechanical servos flexing smoothly. "You've been written before," he said softly. "You will be written again. Perhaps you will even believe it next time." The quills of the servitors around us quickened in unison, the scratching sound swelling until it filled the chamber like the drone of insects everywhere. I turned to leave, but the doors had closed behind me without sound, their surface now covered entirely in text that pulsed faintly like a heartbeat. When I pressed my palm against them, the text rearranged itself, spelling out a sermon in my voice, recounting my arrival and conversion to their cause. The words felt oily beneath my skin, soaking into my palm until I pulled away, gasping, and saw faint black script coiling around my fingers. The archivist's voice came from directly behind me, though I hadn't heard him move. "It will fade when it is remembered. It will remain otherwise." At last, the doors swung open, spilling me back into the main hall where the servitors worked on without pause, smiles fixed and hands never faltering. I stepped outside into the unchanging daylight, but in every poster, statue, and plaque I passed, one of the saints now bore my own face entirely. Citizens bowed slightly as I walked by, not to me, but to the version of me that their paradise had already decided was real eternally. It started with reflections, or at least that's where I noticed him first, in the glass-fronted reliquaries that lined the civic promenade. At a glance, my reflection seemed normal. Same worn coat, same tired eyes, same faint dust on my boots from the forbidden districts I'd trespassed through earlier. But then, the eyes didn't blink when I did, a fraction of a second delay, as though my reflection were receiving instructions from somewhere else. I tried to dismiss it as fatigue, residual vertigo from the Hall of Records, but the delay happened again, in a shop window deliberately, and this time, my reflection smiled. Not the faint guarded curl of lips I might give a stranger, but the wide fixed smile of Euphrosyne's citizens, the kind of smile that didn't fade, that seemed etched into the very muscles, immune to exhaustion, grief, or the slow erosion of years. I turned away quickly, only to catch him again in the chrome plating of a passing automaton, still smiling, still staring at me with unbearable stillness. It was not mimicry. He wasn't copying my movements, but moving independently, always just a fraction ahead or behind, as though testing boundaries carefully. By the time I returned to my assigned quarters, I was deliberately avoiding mirrors, turning over drinking glasses to hide their glossy inner surfaces entirely. Still, I felt him in the periphery. The way the back of my neck prickled, the subtle pull toward any reflective object in the room, always. That night, I dreamt of the saint in the Hall of Records, the one wearing my face, standing at the edge of an endless black mirror. He beckoned, and the mirror rippled outward like a pond, swallowing the sky, the stars, and finally the ground beneath my feet, without warning. I woke to find my hand resting on the glass of the cabinet opposite my bed, palm flat, fingers splayed as though pushing inward carefully. The reflection's hand was pressed back against mine, but where my skin was pale, his was mottled with faint glyphs I couldn't quite decipher clearly. The symbols writhed when I tried to focus like eels beneath water, and his smile widened until I could see more teeth than seemed possible. When I snatched my hand back, the sensation lingered, skin cold, fingers tingling, as though some of those shifting shapes had crossed the barrier effortlessly into me. The next day, walking through the central plaza, I caught him in a puddle left by the irrigation systems that kept the gardens lush constantly. Only this time there was no delay. He moved at the exact same time I did, but his eyes followed something over my shoulder precisely. I turned, heart lurching, but saw nothing but the steady parade of smiling citizens, each gaze empty, yet somehow brimming with unquestioning contentment, unbroken. When I looked back down, he was gone, but the water in the puddle was still rippling, though no wind disturbed the air around me. By the fourth day, the bleed-through was worse. I would see him not only in reflections, but in the spaces between my own thoughts clearly. A flash of him leaning in closer, his smile brittle now, his lips moving as if speaking words I could not quite hear. Sometimes I would feel my own lips twitch into that same expression, unbidden, my jaw aching afterward, as though held in place by unseen hands. It reached its peak when I entered the Cathedral of Radiance to observe the noonday blessing, a ritual of sunlight and hymn that filled the air wholly. As the choir sang, every polished surface in the cathedral, marble floors, golden chalices, the bishop's gilded throne, showed my reflection standing still while I moved forward physically. When the congregation bowed their heads, the reflections all lifted theirs to stare directly at me, hundreds of versions of him smiling in perfect unison. The sound of the choir dulled, and in the silence between notes I heard his voice, not aloud, but inside my skull, like a memory replaying. "You will fit better if you stop resisting. The face is already yours. The rest will follow when it is ready." I stumbled out into the light, heart hammering, the streets twisting subtly in my vision as though the city had shifted to align with his vantage. From then on, I could feel him more distinctly, not just watching, but waiting, pressing against the inside of my skin like a diver against glass. I began to understand that he was not separate from me, not entirely. He was a version the world preferred, one that obeyed perfectly. And the more people looked at me, smiled at me, the stronger he became, feeding on their approval, their belief that I belonged here. Some nights I would wake to find my body sitting upright in bed, hands folded neatly, eyes wide open, staring at the dark window. And though I could not see it directly, I knew the reflection was smiling, patient, until the glass became the only real part of me. The memory came without warning, like a splinter breaking the surface of skin, small at first, then impossible to ignore without bleeding. I was sitting in my quarters, reviewing meaningless civic reports, when I blinked and found myself standing in the central plaza beneath the unchanging sky. The bells were ringing. Not the hour, but a low, sonorous toll that vibrated in the bones more than it reached the ears themselves. Around me, hundreds of citizens stood perfectly still, faces raised toward the artificial sun suspended above the spire of the Cathedral of Radiance entirely. In their hands, each held a thin strip of parchment, blank on one side, but on the other covered in shifting black script like crawling ants. Without prompting, I looked down and realized I was holding one too, though I could not remember receiving it or moving to this place. The bell tolled again, and as one, we all raised the parchment to our foreheads, the ink smearing faintly against skin that suddenly felt fever-hot. The smears bled into shapes, sigils I half recognized from forbidden texts, loops and spirals that seemed to pull at my vision until the plaza blurred entirely. I tried to speak, to ask what this was, but my mouth opened only to let out a tone I did not recognize at all. Around me, every citizen made the same sound, a long, low vibration that harmonized perfectly, like an organ chord sustained without any breath behind it unnaturally. The sound swelled until my bones rattled, and the artificial sun above flickered, not dimming, but revealing something vast moving behind its light entirely. It was not a star, not machinery, more like a shape carved into reality itself, rotating in slow, deliberate arcs that warped the air as it passed. The plaza was gone. In its place stretched a white expanse, featureless except for pillars of glass that reached into a sky I could not comprehend wholly. Inside each pillar floated a person, eyes closed, lips moving soundlessly, their bodies slowly turning in a rhythm that matched the toll of the bells precisely. I stepped forward and my feet left no impression on the white surface. My shadow lagged behind, twitching faintly as if resisting being here fully. One of the glass pillars fractured, and instead of shattering outward, it folded into itself, revealing a figure, my figure, smiling and holding a fresh parchment identical. Without hesitation, he pressed it into my hands. The ink immediately soaked into my skin, crawling up my arm in tight, spiraling patterns uncomfortably. I blinked, and I was back in the plaza, the parchment gone, my arm bare, though I swore the skin still tingled faintly and hummed. The citizens around me lowered their own parchments in unison, smiling faintly, their eyes brighter somehow, as if they'd each been topped up with something invisible. The bells stopped, and we dispersed. No one speaking, no one looking at one another, as if the event had already been filed away as unnecessary. Back in my quarters, I realized something far worse. The memory did not end there. It didn't belong to today. It belonged to every purity rite. I saw them all at once. The same plaza, the same parchment, the same sigils, repeated endlessly, like a recording loop burned into my mind entirely. And yet the faces around me changed. Some younger, some older, some already gone from this world. And still, the ritual remained identical in every possible way. I saw myself among them, over and over, wearing different clothes, different expressions, sometimes standing closer to the spire, sometimes at the very edge watching. Each version of me seemed aware of the others, glancing subtly, as though checking that the loop remained unbroken and the pattern undisturbed forever. The most recent memory, the one I'd just experienced, slotted into place among them like the final bead on a string pulled impossibly tight. I understood then that no one remembered the rites because to remember one was to remember all, and the mind could not hold them safely. The blanks between memories were deliberate. The joy was easier when you did not know it had been fed to you endlessly before. I stared at my reflection in the darkened window, half expecting him to appear, but only I was there, smiling faintly, the expression settling without my consent. And somewhere beyond the plaza, I could feel the tolling begin again, faint but inevitable, as if the next rite had already begun before this ended. The first sign was not darkness, but silence, the kind that arrives so suddenly you can feel it pressing on your skull heavily. I had been walking through the colonnades of the Civic Archive when the air lost its hum, the faint background thrum of the city gone completely. Euphrosyne's perfect gardens, fountains, and plazas had always been bathed in the constant glow of the artificial sun, its position frozen in eternal midday warmth entirely. But now the light above was stuttering, a subtle flicker that made the shadows twitch and crawl like insects across the polished stone around my feet. At first, citizens did not seem to notice. They continued walking, smiling, and greeting each other with the same precise nods they always did, without hesitation or delay. But as the flicker grew longer, stretching into seconds, I saw their faces still locked in those smiles, their eyes widening fractionally in something almost like strain. The air felt colder with each dimming, and I realized with unease that the warmth had never come from the light itself. It was projected too. When the sun's glow cut out entirely for the first time in my memory here, the change in the crowd was immediate and deeply unnatural. No one screamed, no one ran, everyone simply stopped where they were, standing motionless in the pallid, grey-tinted reality that replaced the golden glow instantly. It was then that I noticed the sky was not blue at all, but a vast dome, smooth, metallic, faintly pulsating, as though breathing slowly above us. The sun flared back to life, but now it was wrong. The edges of its circle bled faint, geometric shapes like circuitry bleeding through the illusion. Each pulse of light seemed to sync with something deeper beneath the ground, a rhythm that my own heartbeat started to match against my will. Shadows now moved independently of their owners, stretching or shrinking out of sync, some even bending toward the center of the plaza like drawn by gravity. I caught my own shadow glancing at me, head turning slightly before snapping back into place as the sun flickered yet again without explanation or warning. The citizens resumed walking each time the light returned, their motion smooth, but between the flickers, they froze in place, eyes vacant, yet lips still smiling faintly. It was during one of those frozen moments that I heard it, the grinding sound of colossal machinery somewhere beyond the false sky overhead working slowly. When the light blinked back, I tilted my gaze just enough to catch it, a seam running the length of the sky, barely perceptible against the glare. It wasn't a sky at all. It was a hatch, and something on the other side was testing the locks, pressing outward with deliberate force, carefully. The next blackout lasted longer, long enough for me to see the hatch bulge slightly, a ripple moving across its surface as if something massive shifted within. In the dim grey, the citizens' smiles twitched. not fading but tightening, the muscles straining as though their faces were being held in place from within entirely. I began walking faster, heading toward the Cathedral of Radiance, the highest vantage point in the city, to see more of the sky's expanse fully. Inside, the choir was silent, the bishop absent, but the massive stained glass oculus at the roof offered a direct view of the sun overhead. From here I could see the geometric bleed more clearly, interlocking circles and sharp angles that pulsed faintly, each flash showing a different configuration like a rotating mechanism. I realized the patterns matched the sigils from the purity rites, the same ones that had once crawled up my skin like living ink without end. As I watched, the light stuttered again, and the dome's surface flickered between two states, the gleaming false sky and something else entirely beyond my comprehension. For half a second, I saw the thing behind the hatch, a vast, lidless eye rimmed with metallic growths, its iris an endless spiral inward. It was not looking at the city, it was looking past it, through it, as though Euphrosyne was simply a lens aimed at something else. The sun blazed back to full strength, but now the citizens below had stopped pretending. They were all staring up at the dome in perfect unison. No whispers, no murmurs, just the collective sound of hundreds of throats swallowing at the same time, the motion too synchronized to be humanly natural at all. I stepped back from the oculus, but my reflection in the stained glass did not move. It stayed, smiling faintly, watching the sky with unblinking devotion endlessly. The idea of descending beneath Euphrosyne had always been absurd. The planet was a jewel, a finished masterpiece, not a thing to be dug into without reason. And yet, when the artificial sun's stutter became an hourly inevitability, I found myself at the sealed entrance of the subsurface maintenance lift 7 without authorization. It was not on any citizen map, but my inquisitorial clearance whispered the right codes into the terminal, the door sighing open with a sound far too organic. The lift was nothing like the pristine surface. It reeked faintly of copper and rot, the walls mottled with dark stains that no cleaning servitor had touched. As we descended, the hum of the city above faded, replaced by a deep, slow pulse that I felt through the soles of my boots. The air thickened, humid and faintly warm, carrying a scent like old bandages and rain-soaked leather left to decay inside a sealed trunk completely. When the doors opened, the tunnel ahead was not constructed. It had been grown, the walls curving in unnatural symmetry, textured like muscle fiber frozen mid-flex. Pipes, if they were pipes, ran along the ceiling, translucent enough to show dark fluid pulsing through them in time, with the vibration underfoot constantly. I followed the tunnel downward, noting how the stone walls quivered faintly at my passing, as if reacting to my body heat or heartbeat specifically. The sound changed as I descended, no longer just the slow pulse, but a wet, sliding sound, like something vast shifting its weight in a deep sleep. Hours or minutes, time felt distorted here, passed before the tunnel widened into a cavern that could not exist in a natural geological formation of any kind. The walls were ridged, layered in bands of deep red and grey, and every so often a spasm ran through them, making the floor ripple slightly beneath me. At the centre of the cavern was a structure, though calling it a structure felt wrong, like a cathedral built from coiled muscle and latticed bone interwoven seamlessly. Its windows were translucent membranes, bulging slightly, revealing flickers of light and movement within, as though organs pulsed behind them constantly without pause or rest. A narrow bridge, veined, warm, and faintly moist under my boots, led to the central dais, where a column of pale, glistening tissue rose from the floor steadily. Embedded within the column were shapes, human at first glance but elongated, their features slack, skin stretched thin over protruding bone, like half-formed mannequins breathing faintly. As I approached, their mouths opened in unison, releasing a single breath that carried words directly into my mind, without sound, passing through the air itself. "You are standing on me," the voice said, not from one mouth, but from all, and from the walls, and from the floor at once entirely. "You are standing inside me." The realization landed like a weight. Euphrosyne was not built over bedrock. It was built over something alive, something vast enough to fill the planet's core. The soil above was its skin, the tunnels its veins, the hatch in the sky perhaps nothing more than a single blinking eye sometimes opening. I staggered back, my boots sticking faintly to the bridge, leaving behind strands of pale, fibrous matter that reached after me like tiny, questing fingers. The column shifted, and from its surface emerged something like a hand. 5 long, glistening appendages curling inward, not to touch, but to measure me entirely. "You are not the first," the voice continued, and with it came flashes, images of cities built, populated, and erased upon its surface over millennia without end. I saw Euphrosyne's perfect plazas and gardens dissolve into raw muscle, then reform in new shapes, repeating again and again like a rehearsed performance unending. The citizens, smiling always, were not inhabitants. They were parts, cells, circulating through its systems to perform whatever unfathomable function it required them to serve indefinitely without deviation. "You are a loop," it said, and I could feel it then, memories folding inward, my first day here becoming my last, endlessly replayed in quiet horror. I ran, not out of courage, but out of the desperate instinct to get away before I could feel the pulse in my own chest sink completely. Behind me, the column's many mouths whispered the same phrase over and over in perfect unison: "Do not climb. You are already at the heart." Surface records claimed Euphrosyne had been colonized 3 centuries ago, a beacon world gifted to the Imperium after a glorious compliance campaign concluded successfully. But after what I had seen in the planet's depths, the official history read less like truth and more like a performance for the gullible entirely. I began searching for the earliest records, digging through the central archive, a structure that loomed like a cathedral of data, its shelves stretching into haze above endlessly. The archivists here did not speak. They simply gestured toward terminals, their smiles faint, their eyes bloodshot, as though they had not blinked for days unceasingly. On the oldest entries, I found degradation, not the normal wear of data corruption, but deliberate alterations, each correction perfectly masking what came before in a loop. I bypassed the locks using my inquisitorial access, watching the layers peel away like skin, revealing something raw and unpleasant beneath the propaganda veneer completely. The first colonists were not human settlers at all. They were vats of biomass lowered into the soil, their genetic blueprints uploaded from a place off-world entirely. These vats were designed not to produce life as we know it, but to integrate into the planetary organism, seeding structures and citizens like cultured tissue seamlessly. It was an act not of colonization, but of implantation. Euphrosyne's population was grown by the world itself, then programmed with histories that never occurred in any real past. The oldest footage was worse, an empty, glistening plain of flesh, where the capital now stood, into which the vats were lowered like offerings into a waiting mouth. In one recovered recording, the flesh undulated, swallowing the vats whole, and when it smoothed over again, the outline of streets had formed instantly in perfect symmetry. Within days, figures began walking those streets, fully formed, smiling, waving to no one in particular, their eyes empty, yet tracking unseen things above continuously. The logs identified them as Phase 1 outputs, but every note about their origin had been scrubbed, replaced with generic colonial manifestos praising the Emperor's divine providence. The truth was unmistakable. No ship had ever arrived with families, no prayers had blessed the soil, no banners of victory had been raised here. Euphrosyne had not been settled. It had been grown, its people just as much an organ of the planet as its pulsing tunnels below. The later immigration waves were no different. They were simply replacements grown in deep vaults, released onto the surface to give the illusion of population turnover endlessly. Even off-world visitors were not immune. Files showed that some simply never left, absorbed into the cycle, their records altered to suggest they had returned elsewhere successfully. A chilling detail surfaced in one notation buried under layers of false census data. Integration period, 43.6 hours from first arrival to neural synchronization complete. I felt the number lodge in my skull like a shard. How long had I been on Euphrosyne now? My mind refused to count exactly. The air in the archive grew warm, sticky, and I realized the walls between the shelves were not stone. They were the same tissue I had seen below. One archivist moved closer, her smile fixed, and placed a single parchment in front of me, a relic in a room of hololithic projections entirely. It was a settler registry, but every name was mine, repeated down the page, the dates stretching back centuries into an impossible spiraling loop without break. "You are an old friend," she said, though her lips did not move. The voice came from somewhere behind my own eyes, resonating against my skull. The parchment began to pulse faintly in my hands, warmth seeping into my fingertips as though the ink itself was alive and reaching inward already. I dropped it, but the sensation remained, a ghost heat crawling up my arms toward my chest in slow, rhythmic pulses I could not stop feeling. Looking around, I saw the archivists had stopped moving entirely, all eyes locked on me, their smiles stretching a fraction wider in perfect synchrony now. "You were here before the first sun rose," the voice continued, "and you will be here after the last one dies completely." The lights in the archive dimmed, replaced by the steady glow of veins now visible along the walls, pulsing in the same slow rhythm as before. I turned to leave, but every aisle now stretched into impossible distance, lined not with shelves, but with rows of standing figures all identical to myself precisely. Some blinked, some smiled, some simply watched, silent witnesses to a truth that made the idea of colonists feel like a child's story told to the void. I first noticed it when I laughed at something that wasn't funny. No, not just unfunny, but entirely absent, an empty moment with no stimulus at all. The sound escaped my mouth without my consent, a clean, practiced laugh, perfectly timed to an interaction that had never happened in my actual memory. When I tried to stop, my face ignored me, stretching into a smile so wide it felt as though it would split the skin entirely. The smile lingered long after the laugh faded, my cheeks beginning to ache, but the ache dulled quickly into a warm, complacent numbness impossible to resist. I realized then that it wasn't my expression anymore. It belonged to something else, something that moved my muscles with a deliberate, foreign precision at will. In the plaza, others walked past with the same fixed serenity, their steps perfectly matched, every blink synchronized as though rehearsed for a performance we could not escape. I tried to speak to one, but she interrupted me with a laugh, my laugh, then placed her hand on my shoulder, warmth radiating in measured pulses. Her voice was calm, almost bored, yet carried an undercurrent of authority I could not place. "Your joy is functioning at 84% consistency. Calibration will complete soon." The words chilled me because they weren't addressed to me like a conversation. They were a reading, a status report spoken aloud for something else entirely. I broke away, forcing myself into the side streets, but the further I walked, the more my pace and breathing adjusted to the rhythm in the ground. It became impossible to frown for more than a second. My facial muscles snapped back into the smile like a reflex, as if gripped by invisible hands unseen. Even my thoughts began to shift. Memories of pain and fear felt dulled, rewritten in pastel shades, as though the edges had been filed smooth permanently. At first, I thought I was losing control of my mind, but the truth was more grotesque. It was simply being repurposed for efficiency completely. Every joyful reaction was recorded somewhere, filed away like raw material, and I could feel each one siphoned out of me the moment it formed. It wasn't that Euphrosyne made you happy. It made happiness happen on schedule, whether you wanted it or not, and then extracted it cleanly. I saw it in the others too. Their smiles were not expressions, but functions. Their laughter not release, but harvest. A crop tended and collected daily. The parks were busiest at harvest hours, when families gathered without reason, sharing stories that went nowhere, each exchange ending in the same perfectly timed laughter. Children skipped rope in unison, each landing with identical force, their eyes unfocused, their smiles fixed like painted masks, hiding something hollow behind completely. When I tried to resist, when I forced my mouth closed, my chest tightened, my breath caught, and a wave of dizziness nearly drove me to my knees instantly. The relief when I smiled again was immediate, flooding my body with warmth, though it carried the sour aftertaste of submission that I could not shake. I began to track the moments my joy was taken, the subtle tightening of the temples, the faint shimmer in the air above the plazas precisely at that time. It was as though the atmosphere itself was the conduit, carrying emotions like data to some central receiver buried deep within the planetary organism beneath everything. Once during one of these harvests, I saw the shimmer arc visibly toward the horizon, a pale streak vanishing into the distant mountains beyond all settlements. The sensation left behind was hollowing, like the aftermath of deep grief, but my smile stayed, my laugh still ready, my hands still gesturing in pleasant conversation automatically. It hit me then with the clarity of a killing blow. My joy was not my own, and it had never been mine entirely. Whatever had grown this world did not simply inhabit us, it used us, each emotion a resource, each thought adjusted for maximum yield without waste at all. When I finally spoke this aloud to someone, a market vendor, his face locked in that same calm bliss, he only nodded and said, "Correct, you are functioning." There was no malice in his tone, no threat, just the flat statement of a fact, the same way one might read a weather report plainly. And somehow, that was worse than any threat could have been, because it confirmed there was nothing to fight, only a system to obey forever. I left the market in silence, my smile unwavering, and realized with horror that even the fear coursing through me was being collected too, without mercy. It began in the plaza at midday, the hour when the harvest of joy reached its peak, the air shimmering faintly above the gathered crowds. I had been moving toward the outer market when every single person around me froze in perfect unison, their smiles locked and their eyes unfocused completely. The stillness was absolute, not a blink, not a breath, not even the shifting weight of someone balancing on tired legs after standing too long. And then, without warning, their mouths opened as one, but no sound emerged, only the sight of jaws moving in unnatural synchrony without any variation between them. At first I thought perhaps I had gone deaf, but the truth was worse. There was no sound to hear at all anymore. The plaza became an impossible silence, so complete it seemed to press against my skull, erasing even the faint hum of blood in my ears. Yet my body reacted as though hearing something. My skin prickled, my heartbeat shifted its rhythm, and my vision shimmered at the edges like heat haze distorting distance. The movements of their mouths began to synchronize with that new rhythm, forming shapes that felt wrong to look at, as though the meaning bypassed language entirely. It wasn't music. It was something closer to a command written directly into the nervous system, bypassing the mind and lodging itself deeper in the body. I felt my own jaw beginning to move against my will, my teeth parting, my lips forming the same silent shapes as those around me involuntarily. Panic rose, but it was muffled instantly, as though my fear had been plucked out of me before it could fully take form at all. In its place came a spreading calm, not pleasant but necessary, the kind that strips away thought so your body can simply obey instructions without distraction. Whatever was being sung did not require sound. It required only the shaping of intent, the shared act of moving as one unified mechanism entirely. The air seemed to grow heavy, not with heat or weight, but with presence, like being watched by something standing just behind the veil of reality itself. I realized then that this was no performance for each other. This was directed outward, or perhaps upward, towards something vast enough to notice from an impossible distance. For a moment, the sky above flickered, not clouds shifting, but the entire blue dome blinking like an eye, its gaze sweeping across the frozen plaza deliberately. The people did not react. Their mouths continued the silent chorus, their bodies swaying slightly now in a motion that matched my own without conscious choice at all. I fought to stop, to still my jaw, but my muscles burned with resistance, as though the act of disobedience was tearing something far deeper than flesh. When I finally forced my mouth closed, the calm shattered instantly, replaced by a splitting headache and a metallic taste flooding my tongue unpleasantly. The crowd around me turned in perfect unison, their smiles never faltering, their eyes locking onto mine with the weight of a shared accusation unspoken. One stepped forward, a child, her face serene, her voice emerging where no sound had been seconds ago. "You are not singing, and that is wrong." The moment she spoke, the rest resumed normal motion, the plaza returning to its marketplace rhythm as if nothing at all had occurred mere seconds before. Yet I could still feel the shape of the song in my jaw, the ghost memory of moving in unison with hundreds of others perfectly. I knew then that the song had not ended. It was still happening somewhere beneath perception, and my body was still part of it unwillingly. The child did not leave. She simply watched me until I turned away, the weight of her silent scrutiny following like a tether through every street I walked. In the reflection of a shop window, I saw my own lips moving faintly, forming the shapes again even as I tried to hold them still. The worst part was not that I couldn't stop. It was that deep down a part of me wanted to keep singing forever. The announcement began as a shimmer in the air, a pressure behind the eyes, the kind that precedes storms or migraines or artillery you cannot physically hear. Citizens stopped mid-step, their smiles brightening a fraction, ribbons tightening subtly on wrists, and every reflective surface in the plaza flattened its distortions like a soldier standing straighter. A herald climbed the cathedral steps, voice amplified without vox, calm and precise, promising reassurance, unity, civic tranquility, and a renewed contact with imperial benediction beyond question. I felt the hoop vibrate in my satchel, the coin cool against my wrist, the ribbon dampen, and somewhere underground, the pulse quickened like withheld applause. "Prepare hearts, prepare recollection," the herald intoned. "Attune yourselves to blessing," and the crowd leaned inward together, as if a giant hand pressed their foreheads gently forward. Prefect Klein appeared on the balcony, immaculate as always, eyes sharp, smile mathematically correct, fingers tapping the rail in a cadence that matched subterranean rhythms precisely. "Today," she said, "we receive the Emperor's living name," and the word name slid into me like warm metal, a key seeking an unfamiliar yet welcoming lock. The plaza's humming stilled, the artificial sun steadied, the dome above cooled, and every mouth softened open in anticipation, tongues ready to cradle a gilded syllable perfectly. I tried to breathe slowly, counting wrong on purpose, but the air thickened, matching my lungs to the city's metronome, turning resistance into wheezing, then into surrender inevitably. When the broadcast struck, it carried no sound, only a shape pushed through thought, a pressure molded into meaning, a syllable hammered without vibration into absolute recognition. The name blossomed like light inside the skull, and everything extraneous curled black at the edges, memories burning tidily, leaving only fragrance and ash and empty gratitude. I tasted gold again, brighter than the vault's honey, harsher than incense. Something surgical like antiseptic poured through books until their pages forget letters entirely forever. I reached for yesterday, found only warmth, searched for the tunnels, found only cleanliness, sought the child's hoop, found only a circle labeled suitable recreational implement without personal significance. The broadcast did not erase the past by tearing it away. It reshelved it under providence, a cabinet that locks quietly and swallows every borrowed key entirely. I clutched the coin hard enough to bruise, whispering a miscounted creed, and a sliver returned, Veron's lamp flickering, rain smell in stacks, a ledger thudding obstinately. Then the name pulsed again, brighter, and the recollection slid like soap, clean, guiltless, gone, replaced by brochure sentences that fit everywhere and argued with nothing ever. Around me, citizens sighed as one, not with relief, but completion, like gears aligning teeth after long grind, joy oiled, regret dissolved, friction filed into compliance permanently. Klein's voice rode the afterglow, harmony restored. Attend to your daily bliss. And the crowd dispersed efficiently, smiling wider, steps lighter, eyes emptier, yet perfectly aligned forward. I stood alone in the sudden quiet, holding a satchel that felt heavier with absence, recognizing the trick. Remove splinters and the mind forgets hands entirely. Back in my quarters, the mirror greeted me like a priest, silvered surface untroubled, reflection devout, jaw obedient, eyes polished, my name a commendation rather than personhood. I tried to write a report. The header formatted itself. On renewed grace, following sacred transmission, subheading minor discrepancies corrected, author citizen of recognition smilingly. I deleted the title, replaced it with emergency note, but the cursor slid back, retyping the sanctioned words with patient confidence, promising to help shoulder administrative burdens permanently. I opened a hidden drawer, retrieved the scrap bearing my palm-etched line. If they erase names, misfile yours. But the letters blurred, then rearranged into polite gratitude sentences. The city's broadcast channel remained open somewhere inside me, a low, continuous thread repeating the syllable, not loudly, just insistently, like a tutor correcting posture graciously. I needed noise that wasn't theirs, so I struck a cup against the desk. The sound arrived with relief, a small, bright profanity against hymnals. The reflection winced, as if the clang bruised it, and for a breath the smile slipped, revealing something tired and older and infinitely more interesting beneath. I slammed the cup again, then again, counting wrong, forcing arrhythmia into the room. The mirror's silver quivered, the broadcast thread crackled, and memory bled stubborn color. Sewer heat in the culvert, flesh walls quivering, the choir's hum, the vault's narcotic honey, the boys' hoop framing impossible streets. Varen whispering misfile, misfile, misfile steadily. The name surged once more, pushing back, elegant and devastating, the way politeness smothers argument by clapping gently until the mouth forgets what teeth are for entirely. I staggered to the window, flung it open. Air rushed in unguided, carrying dust, real dust, not curated scent, and the taste of unplanned weather immediately. In the alley below, a beggar, a thing paradise should not logically allow, sat cross-legged, ribbon missing, smile absent, eyes sharp and unpolished like river stones precisely. He looked up when I leaned out and pointed to his ear, then to the sky, then tapped his chest twice, rhythm off by design, deliberately. I climbed down the service ladder, landing clumsily, knees barking, grateful for pain because it arrived without permissions, bearing no certificate of civic usefulness whatsoever. "Can you hear it?" I asked, and he shook his head, grinning a lopsided grin that looked like survival rather than curatorship carefully. "Can you remember?" He countered, and the name pushed again. For a second I forgot the ladder, the dust, the alley, his face, everything mercilessly. He spat, an ugly human sound, and the syllable faltered. He caught it with the heel of his hand, mimed crushing it, flinging it aside contemptuously. "Spit breaks benediction," he said, delighted. "Doesn't delete it, but makes it slip. Need grit, need phlegm, need anything rude the brochures dislike thoroughly." I laughed, a cracked, unbeautiful noise, and memory returned in shards. Sector Omega's warning plate, the seam in the sky, the core's living column entirely. We walked together to the market where speakers hid inside ornamental lanterns. Whenever the pressure rose, he coughed theatrically, stomped off beat, muttered miscounted prayers stubbornly. Around us, smiles twitched in disapproval, but the broadcast faltered minutely, and through that stutter the city's real air leaked, tasting like iron and tomorrow, promisingly. "Where did you learn that?" I asked, and he tapped his throat, then his belly, then the ground. A grammar of bodies resisting polite narratives quietly. "Forgotten craft," he said. "Pre-loop manners, how to be impolite precisely enough that machines mistake you for weather instead of congregation." The lantern above flared, the syllable pressed down like a hand on a child's head. His grin widened, then slouched into something like wicked patience beautifully. "Say his title wrong," he whispered. "Drop an honorific, add a cough. Not blasphemy, just bad form. Empires hate bad form more than heresy amusingly." We performed a duet of discourtesies, mismatched claps, interrupted bows, off-tempo hallelujahs, and each breach carved a slit where memories could wriggle through, gasping briefly. I remembered the vault's sleepers, the roots in their wrists, the word "finished," whispered like velvet execution. I remembered Klein's tapping finger matching subterranean pulses exactly. I remembered the child admitting he ages when stories end, and the saint's page writing itself, wearing my face like polite theft, smiling without apology. The broadcast retaliated, not louder, cleaner, scrubbing edges, flooding charm. Moments ago I had never suffered, never bled, never doubted. Surely I would never require endings, hopefully. I faked a sneeze, an inelegant explosion. The beggar applauded, and 3 seconds of memory returned crisp as chalk, the hatch above, bulging, something vast, unblinking. We ducked into a side chapel where the mosaic eyes tracked us. The speakers hummed devoutly. I scrawled on the wall with a nail, deliberately. If the name arrives, spit. If spit fails, miscount. If miscount fails, bleed. Blood is uneditable shortly. The letters glistened. The tile tried to reject them, grout puckering, but the gouge remained, a small, rude permanence where etiquette preferred gloss always. We stepped back into the street. The broadcast surged anew, a velvet tide. The beggar bowed extravagantly wrong, and I answered with a crooked salute rebelliously. For a breath the pressure eased. I spoke quickly, stacking memory with memory before courtesy could reclaim them, laying a trail of splinters back to myself desperately. Klein crossed the square, saw the chapel scrawl, paused and touched her ribbon. Her smile didn't change, but her eyes admitted calculation, not mere compliance, convincingly. She lifted 2 fingers, permission or warning, and the lanterns dimmed. The syllable receded like a tide reluctantly. The plaza exhaled, pleased to find itself unchanged entirely. The beggar vanished, as beggars do when stories dislike them. Crumbs on the step, scuff on the stone, proof the city failed to curate everything properly. Back in my room I wrote the name phonetically, hoping to trap it, but the ink refused, pooling into a polite blot labeled Reverence undesirably. So I did what the archivist once begged. I misfiled it into my body, pressing the coin to tongue, ribbon around wrist, hoop over heart, determinedly. When the next broadcast came, I spat first, counted wrong second, bled third, and the syllable slid off me like rain off stone, remembering weather stubbornly. Outside 1,000 smiles widened, inside a single sentence survived untouched. Paradise ends when bad manners multiply faster than edits. Teach discourtesy like prayer carefully. I slept with my jaw clenched, rude and grateful, and dreamed of Veren shelving thunder under poetry, where nobody would dare sand it smoother ever again. Morning arrived, wearing its rehearsed brightness. The lanterns purred politely. The plaza applauded the day, and somewhere beneath, the core turned in its sleep appreciatively. I buttoned my coat, dirty on purpose, and walked into the broadcast's velvet with gravel in my mouth, ready to remember impolitely until remembering finally sticks successfully. I found the vessel in docking sector 12, a district I'd never seen on any sanctioned map. Its air tasting like metal scraped from a cathedral's organ pipes left to corrode deliberately in rain. The hangar doors stood open to an ocean of cloud, thin enough to see the pale arc of the planet's dome stretching far above, but thick enough to hide anything waiting beneath patiently. It sat on the platform like an answered prayer, sleek, angular, hull gleaming with what looked like void-hardened plating, markings worn down to vague glyphs by countless unrecorded departures and arrivals entirely unacknowledged officially. I approached with caution, coin in one pocket, ribbon coiled tight in the other, counting deliberately wrong to keep the broadcast's lingering threads from aligning my thoughts into civic obedience once again. Up close, the ship's surface had a strange translucence. The matte plating softened into fibers, the edges showing grain, and when I brushed it, it flexed faintly like dry parchment given shape. The ramp was already down, a perfect slope into shadow, and as I stepped on it, the sound was wrong. No metal clang, only the muffled crackle of heavy paper creasing reluctantly. Inside, the bulkheads rose high and narrow, braced by ribbed beams that peeled slightly at the edges, ink bleeding in neat architectural lines, marking out fictional conduits and engines that could not exist. I moved toward the cockpit, each step softer, more muted, as though I were walking deeper into a book, the pages wrapping me in their artificial gravity of description. The flight chair was waiting, its padding an elaborate illusion, painted shading on folded sheets, and the control panel held dozens of hand-drawn buttons labeled in a language my mind wanted to know instantly. I pressed one, the surface dented, then sprang back, leaving a faint smear of graphite, and somewhere beyond the walls came the sound of paper tearing slowly, like a curtain unraveling. The viewport lit, not with void, but with a drawing of void, blackness stippled with dots that shifted as though an unseen hand adjusted the illustration with each passing heartbeat, methodically. Then the voice came, smooth as Klein's but thinner, like ink stretched too far across too much paper. "Your departure is approved. Please recite the exit litany clearly and without hesitation." I stood there counting wrong, mouthing nothing, because every instinct told me the moment I spoke the litany aloud, the ship would fold me flat into its fiction. "You must comply," the voice insisted, and the viewport stars rearranged into words. "Travel is granted to those who agree they were never anywhere to begin with." I backed away, hand on the satchel, feeling the coin's weight, the ribbon's texture, needing something real to anchor me to the floor that flexed faintly underfoot. The ramp began to rise, not mechanically, but like a page being turned, the ceiling lowering as if the ship were closing a chapter it no longer required me in. I lunged, grabbing at the edges, my fingers coming away dusty, the taste of pulp in my teeth as if I'd bitten into the hull itself without meaning to. Landing hard on the platform, I rolled, coughing up a scrap of paper, edges browned, words smudged, that read, "Citizen Vel, this scene ends here." The hangar behind me shimmered, the ship folded in on itself, smaller with each blink, until it was only a single page drifting down, curling as it fell gently. When it landed, the wind caught it, flipping it over. On the back was an illustration of the hangar empty, perfectly matching the space now around me exactly. The platform doors began to close, guided by no visible machinery, the edges meeting like two fingers pinching a secret shut. Beyond them, the clouds churned unnaturally in silent applause. I bolted for the only visible corridor, my boots scuffing dust into the air, and the walls here were not paper, but they wore paper skins, maps of themselves pasted over. Every junction showed new destinations, docking sector 13, 14, 15, but each map was drawn in the same hand, all corridors looping back toward the central hall where I'd started moments earlier. I tried peeling one of the wall maps. Beneath was another, and beneath that another, each version older. The ink fading to near ghost lines but always depicting the same impossible layout. The broadcast pressure returned faintly, whispering compliance, and the corridor's ceiling lowered subtly, as though the city itself leaned in to watch me accept the script offered with polite inevitability. "You left the scene," the voice said, softer now. "But the scene did not leave you. Please return to your assigned departure role immediately." I ran instead, ripping pages from walls as I went, stuffing them into my coat, hoping that enough stolen paper might jam the story's spine. At last I reached a service hatch, real metal under my hands, and forced it open. The air beyond was cold and damp, smelling of stone and oil and disuse. Crawling through, I heard the paper tear behind me, a long, disappointed sigh, and when I looked back, the corridor was gone, replaced by a wall printed with a closed hatch. The tunnel ahead led upward, light pooling faintly at the end, and I told myself it would be real light, unprinted, even if I had to bleed to prove it. But when I emerged, I was in the plaza. Same perfect cobblestones, same smiling citizens, same ornamental lanterns hiding speakers, and Klein herself at the far end, looking as though I'd never left at all. She walked toward me slowly, her ribbon twitching like a living vein, and when she stopped, she pressed something into my palm, a folded piece of paper warm from her hand. "Your ship," she said simply, and when I unfolded it, there it was, the drawing, the hangar, the ramp lowered, waiting once again. This time, the viewport stars were already shaped into words. "Try again until you accept there is no outside." And before I could crumple it, The page softened in my fingers, stretching into the shape of a ramp beneath my boots once more. The ramp under my feet extended without sound, without weight, its surface flexing in rhythm with my steps, as if it anticipated each placement before I made it consciously. The air thickened again, that same invisible glue binding my thoughts in neat, organized rows, stripping away the scattered edges I needed to think like myself again, clearly. Behind me, the plaza was gone, no retreat possible, replaced instead by an alley I knew didn't exist yesterday, walls plastered with fresh paint still drying, smelling faintly of citrus and ash together. When I reached the top of the ramp, there was no ship, no hangar, only another street unfurling itself in front of me like a ribbon being rolled onto a spool deliberately. The buildings along it blinked into being in fragments. Windows first, then the facades, then the details like shutters and hanging signs, each component sliding into place as if obeying a sequence written elsewhere. A grocer appeared on the corner, stacking fruit with a smile so rigid it cast shadows, the basket in his hand materializing between blinks rather than being picked up naturally. I took 3 steps forward, and the shadows shifted ahead of me, lengthening into the next block's architecture before the stone had even formed beneath my boots, firmly enough to hold. When I stopped moving, the world held its breath, waiting. The half-built buildings at the far end wavered slightly, as though unsure whether to finish themselves without my participation in their design. Then the whisper came again, not in my ear but in the soles of my feet. We build what you walk toward. We erase what you turn away from. Turning around proved it. The alley behind me was now a corridor lined with arched doorways, every one of them labeled in that familiar hand from the ship's folded paper schematics exactly. I stepped to the nearest door. The lettering on the placard rippled like ink in water, rewriting itself from council chamber to your quarters to the scene you left earlier. When I reached for the handle, the placard settled on confession room, and the door itself sighed inward, exhaling the scent of fresh paint and something metallic underneath faintly. Inside, the walls were blank paper, but they pulsed slightly, and I realized each pulse matched the beat of my own heart precisely, no faster, no slower at all. In the center stood a desk, wood painted onto stiff parchment, and behind it sat an archivist, or at least the shape of one, his face a smudge where features should be visible. He held a pen already poised above a ledger that filled itself with neat lines of script, as his hand hovered unmoving completely above the page. "You walk, we write," he said, voice like crumpled parchment. "And when you stop walking, we wait, but stopping too long makes the scene fray." I glanced down, and indeed the floor at the edges of the room curled upward slightly, the paint cracking, showing nothing beneath but whiteness without depth or surface. The archivist's smudge face tilted. "If you want the world to stay, you must keep moving. If you want it to change, choose carefully." I backed toward the door, unwilling to let the room unravel entirely. But the moment my hand touched the frame, the archivist's voice cut sharper, less human. "You can't walk out of the script. You are the script," he said, and the ledger slammed shut without his hands moving at all to close it. The door behind me opened into a marketplace I didn't recognize. The stalls were fully stocked, vendors shouting offers in words that dissolved as soon as they reached my ears deliberately. Every path I chose bent subtly back toward the plaza, even though the streets appeared to wind away from it, like the city was rotating around me without showing the motion openly. Once I tried bolting down an alley as fast as I could. The buildings leaned inward as though to funnel me, their windows dropping shut like eyelids closing to sleep quickly. At the alley's end, I emerged into an almost perfect copy of my assigned lodging, except for the fact that every object was in reverse, left for right, front for back precisely. The mirror on the wall, however, showed the room in its correct orientation, but the reflection of me was still facing the wrong way entirely. It spoke without moving its lips. "You're writing too slow. The world is losing coherence. Decide what you want this place to become now." I shook my head, refusing the premise, but even as I turned, the bed collapsed into loose sheets of paper, the table sketching itself into a set of stairs upward rapidly. I climbed them because not climbing seemed worse. each step appearing just before my foot landed, the ones behind curling into blankness without pause at all. At the top was a balcony overlooking the city, or the idea of it. Blocks still assembling, clouds still painting themselves, streets bending into letters too large to read fully. From here, I could see it. The layout of the city was forming a massive glyph visible only from above, lines made from streets and rivers alike. It was not Imperial script, nor Low Gothic, nor anything I'd studied. It was something older, each curve heavy with intent that felt predatory somehow. And the moment I recognized that, the unfinished blocks began to twist faster, buildings assembling with manic urgency, as if embarrassed I'd seen the glyph too soon, unexpectedly. Somewhere behind me, the archivist's voice came again, closer now, almost whispering at my shoulder. "Keep walking, Vel. You know what happens when the writing stops, don't you?" I stepped forward without meaning to, the balcony edge reshaping into another street instantly, and the city surged to meet me like a tide rushing in to cover bare sand quickly. And I understood then. There was no map of Euphrosyne, because Euphrosyne was always being written in the moment you experienced it, never before, never after, only during. Stopping would mean seeing the edges of the page, and if I saw those edges, something waiting beyond them would see me in return finally. I kept moving because the city demanded it, each step dictating the next street's existence, each breath written into the architecture like a signature sealing my place here permanently. Yet somewhere in the rhythm of my stride, something loosened, an old memory, fragile and sharp, sliding free like a knife forgotten in the folds of a cloak long unworn. It wasn't about Euphrosyne, not directly. It was about my assignment orders, the parchment stamped with the Inquisitorial seal, the words crisp, the ink still smelling of iron faintly. I remembered now, with absolute clarity, that the orders had never mentioned investigation or observation. They had spoken only of returning to alignment and finalizing archival transfer without explanation. And beneath those words, in smaller script I had ignored at the time, was a phrase that made my pulse stutter now. Recipient, Vel Sarin, record purge approved. I had thought it a clerical error, some overzealous scribe applying terminology meant for data, not flesh, not thought, but now it landed in my mind with perfect cold precision. I had not been sent here to uncover Euphrosyne's secrets. I had been sent here because my own were to be erased entirely, without any appeal or record left. And what better place to erase a person than in a world that writes itself fresh with every step, overwriting what came before without trace? The streets seemed to sense the turn in my thoughts, the lines of the paving stones reconfigured, narrowing toward a single point ahead like a funnel's inevitable end. I followed despite myself because the alternative, stopping, would let me see the page's edge, and I knew that was a final sight. At the funnel's end was a plaza I didn't remember approaching, though its design was familiar. Concentric circles of white stone, each marked with script that shifted under my gaze. In the center stood a chair, no, a throne, though made of folded paper stacked impossibly high, each sheet trembling slightly as if breathing along with the wind's rhythm. On the throne sat me, or a version of me, eyes closed, hands resting on the armrests, lips moving in a near-silent cadence I could almost match instinctively. I stepped closer, the soundless words becoming clearer, not in sound, but in meaning, each phrase a small erasure. This face is no one's face. This voice is no one's voice. My double opened his eyes then, and there was nothing in them, no iris, no pupil, only blank parchment that reflected everything around us, without absorbing it at all. "You arrived here thinking you were still yourself," he said, and though his mouth moved, the voice came from the paper walls of the plaza instead. "But you came because you were already fading, and here we finish the work, not by killing, but by unmaking completely." I told him I could still remember my name, my service, the worlds I'd walked, but even as I said it, those memories shifted in their order, some edges dissolving. "What you remember is already written by this place," he replied, leaning forward so that the scent of dry parchment filled my nostrils like dust in an abandoned archive. "Your arrival, your steps, your thoughts, These are lines on the page. You do not own them. They were always ours entirely. I wanted to deny it, to claim some core of self they could not touch, but the plaza itself seemed to pulse in disagreement, the stones beneath my boots rearranging, each step I'd taken to get here now unspooled in reverse, playing out as ink strokes retracting, streets folding back into blankness behind me without pause at all. The me on the throne stood and stepped down, and with each movement my own body felt lighter, as though weight, not physical but identity, was being siphoned away smoothly. "You think you're leaving with knowledge," he said, "but you'll leave only with what we want left, the smile, the calm, the absence." And I realized with sudden clarity that the citizens, the unaging smiles, the perfect gardens, they were not the result of control, they were the product of absence itself. Euphrosyne was not a paradise despite its emptiness. It was a paradise because of it, because the people had been erased until nothing remained but agreeable shells entirely. The me that faced me now reached out, placing his hand, my hand, on my chest, and the contact made the world flicker, my body turning faint at the edges noticeably. "You came here to forget," he whispered, not into my ear, but into the space my mind had once filled, and I felt my own name dissolve like sugar in water. When I tried to speak, the sound didn't form words. It formed letters that fluttered from my mouth like loose scraps of paper caught on a wind. The other me gathered them, tucked them into his robe, and stepped back toward the throne, as though returning me to storage. I stumbled from the plaza, without deciding to, the streets forming ahead of me in a straight path toward the city's glowing horizon without variation or obstruction. Every person I passed smiled that same smile, their lips faintly parting, as if reciting the lines I had just been given in the plaza. I knew then that my memories were not gone. They were simply not mine anymore. They belonged to the city, to the script, to Euphrosyne's page. And the most terrifying part wasn't that I was losing myself. It was that, step by step, I was starting to feel relieved about it happening. The horizon shimmered not with light, but with the constant flicker of words writing themselves across the sky, lines so vast they bent with the curvature of the world beneath. As I walked toward it, the city behind me folded away like discarded pages, each building flattening before vanishing into the whiteness, between steps entirely without a trace. Ahead, the glow resolved into something like glass, but breathing, a dome of translucent parchment stretched to the edges of sight, each sheet trembling like muscle under strain repeatedly. I placed my hand against it, and the vibration leapt up my arm, straight to the base of my skull, filling my head with the taste of copper and dust. The surface yielded slightly, not breaking but admitting me as though I had always belonged inside whatever lay beyond this membrane entirely. I stepped through, and the world inverted, not just colors, but orientation. Sky became floor, floor became sky, and the sun I thought I knew dangled beneath me, tethered by threads of script. Here, the city was gone, replaced by an endless plane of machinery that wasn't metal, but bone and parchment, gears made from teeth and axles spun from jointed spines deliberately. Everywhere, giant quills dipped themselves into inkwells the size of cathedrals, scrawling rivers of script across the ground that vanished the moment I tried to follow their meaning. And above all of it, suspended like an ornament in a cathedral's dome, was a single eye, not human, not even organic, formed entirely from concentric rings of writing, turning slowly. It was watching me, yes, but more than that, it was recording me, its movements shaping the quills, its gaze dictating what the script machines wrote in perfect synchrony without error. I understood then that I had never been moving freely. Each step I thought I chose had already been written by the great eyes turning pages in advance. The citizens of Euphrosyne were not merely erased, they were absorbed into the script as actors, vessels for lines already determined long before they had ever lived here. And now I felt the machinery's attention shifting fully onto me, my thoughts becoming sluggish, each word in my mind being matched to a place in the great book above. A voice, not the archivists, not my doubles, but something vast, spoke from everywhere at once, folding the space into a single tone that pressed into my chest. "You have walked our streets. You have spoken our lines. You have watched from outside, believing you were safe in your seat. The eye widened, not physically but in focus, and the machinery's rhythm quickened, quills scratching faster, the parchment beneath them beginning to smoke with the friction of constant rewriting. You are not outside. You never were. You are reading because we wrote you into this. Your eyes are the ink in our script now. I staggered backward, but there was no backward, only more of the bone and parchment plain, quills turning toward me as though my retreat had been anticipated long before. The great eyes' rings rotated faster, and for an instant I saw what lay beyond them, whiteness without end, and in it shapes like cities collapsing and reforming in endless repetition. This is not a paradise for them, the voice said, nor for you. It is a paradise for the script itself, the perfect place where nothing exists except what we write. The plane beneath me shuddered, and I realized the vibration matched my pulse, as though my heartbeat was now one of the machine's cogs, driving it forward. You can close this book, turn off this transmission, walk away, the voice continued, each word coiling tighter in my chest, but you will not stop reading it, because the truth settled cold and undeniable. I had been here before, and I would be here again, not as the narrator, not as the investigator, but as the audience itself. Somewhere far above, or far below, depending on how the inversion was measured, the dome of parchment rippled, and for the briefest instant, I saw through it into another room entirely. A dark room, a single screen glowing, someone leaning forward in their chair, eyes wide, scrolling down as the words appeared in real time deliberately. The machinery's voice softened then, almost like a whisper through paper. There you are, watching from inside. We've been writing you into this since the first line you ever saw. I wanted to scream, to break the connection, to shatter the page, but the quills were already turning back to me, copying my reaction into the script, sealing it permanently. The eye blinked once, and the world folded in on itself, taking the city, the plaza, the glyph, and me into a single, final word I could not read. And if you think you can walk away from this, if you think closing this will keep you outside, then you've already forgotten the truth of Euphrosyne. You think you're the reader, you think you're safe, but you've already been written into the page, and now the script will wait until you turn the next one. If you felt touched by this journey, like, share and subscribe to this channel for the next transmission.